Welcome everyone to tonight's Planning Commission meeting. We'll go ahead and begin. First, we are going to start with the approval of the minutes for the August 22nd, 2018 meeting. Do I have a motion?
I'll move we approve the minutes from the last meeting.
Thank you, Maureen. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Second by Clark. And the vote, Amy?
Yes.
Brenda? Yes. Maureen?
Yes.
And Clark. All right, those pass. No report from me. Anything from you, Maureen? From staff, from the director?
Nothing to report tonight. Thank you.
All right. So we'll be moving on to our public hearings tonight. I do have a few cards from people if you would like. It kind of helps streamline the process and helps with our record. If you are wanting to speak on one of our topics tonight, there's some cards right outside the door there that you can put your name on and hand it up here to us, and then we can make sure you speak. It's not necessary to speak. You'll still get a chance to speak even if you didn't fill one of those out. So let's go ahead and start with our first item, which is the 22 to 26 North M Street eleemosynary conditional use and lot consolidation.
So this is a request by Angela Dean. She's representing Ronald McDonald House Charities to expand an existing eleemosynary operation located at 935 East South Temple to 4 adjacent properties to the north to provide additional space and amenities to be utilized by the residents. An eleemosynary is generally a nonprofit use that provides housing for people that are being treated at a nearby hospital. This type of use is a conditional use in the RMF 35 zoning district, and that's why the petition is before you this evening. This process looks at potential impacts of the use on surrounding neighbors and compatibility of adjacent uses, and the proposal includes consolidating 5 parcels and a public right-of-way into 1 parcel. Staff is recommending approval of the proposal with conditions. The property is also located within the Avenues Local Historic District, and therefore any exterior changes to the existing single-family homes as well as any of the new accessory structures located in the outdoor space, those are under the purview of the Historic Landmark Commission or staff on behalf of the Historic Landmark Commission. Conditional uses are not reviewed by the Historic Landmark Commission, so the proposed use of the buildings is not subject to that approval process. The existing single-family homes are identified as historically contributing structures, and they are proposed to be converted into meeting spaces. And the existing commercial building that is not historically contributing to the Avenues District will be demolished to develop the outdoor space for Ronald McDonald House. Although this is not under the purview of the Planning Commission, I do want to point out that non-contributing buildings and contributing buildings have different standards of approval for exterior alterations and demolition requests. The proposed outdoor space will be accessed through a secured gate through a new fence that is proposed along M Street. There's an existing failing retaining wall and fence along the north property line, and the applicant intends to replace that as part of the development. Special requests for additional fence height in local districts are under the authority of the Landmark Commission. Similar to special exceptions that you all look at, they can be approved by staff if they meet the standards of approval. So those fences with additional fence height will be processed through that, through the Landmark Commission authority. Proposed amenities in the outdoor area include green space and walking paths, a group picnic seating, gardens, play areas, and a stage. And staff from the Ronald McDonald House has indicated that this area may be used to host things like dinner parties and other similar events. And the proposed stage will be used for performances, which may include music groups. However, the applicant has indicated that there will not be any amplified sound associated with the stage. And proposed lighting for the site is downlit. Gathering areas on the property are generally located central to the development, which helps buffer the adjacent properties from the proposed use. There are also noise regulations which constitute what is a noise nuisance, and so if the conditional use is approved, those standards would still be in effect. Some concerns were raised by adjacent property owners regarding the possibility of a smoking area. And there is an existing smoking area off of N Street, and the applicant has indicated that smoking will not be allowed in the new proposed outdoor space, and staff is recommending that signs be posted regarding the no smoking rules for this development. We are also recommending that any new and existing smoking areas be located a minimum of 25 feet from adjacent properties. In regards to the public process, staff sent notices to East Central Community Council and Greater Avenues. We did not receive any requests to have the project presented at community council meetings. We did hold a city open house. We had about 10 members from the public attend that meeting. And we have received 12 public comments. Those are all included in attachment 8 of your staff report. 9 of those were in support. 1 public comment outlined some concerns that they had, and 2 phone calls were in opposition. State and city code require that conditional uses be approved if reasonable conditions can be imposed on the use to mitigate any of the anticipated effects of the use. Staff has reviewed the proposal and finds that it meets the required standards of approval. And again, we're recommending approval of the proposal, and the complete analysis and findings are included in F and G of your staff report. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer those at this time. Otherwise, the applicant is also here.
Great, thank you. Any questions right now? No? Okay, we'll go ahead and have the applicant come on up.
Thank you. My name is Carrie Romano, and I serve as the CEO for Ronald McDonald House Charities of the Intermountain area. Our architect, Angela Dean, was called to jury duty in West Jordan today, and she's trying to get here. Thanks for the opportunity to present this project for your consideration. As you know, the Ronald McDonald House backyard green space expansion will be directly north of our property at 935 East South Temple on the M Street properties now owned by Ronald McDonald House Charities. As background, we offer a temporary home away from home, which means free housing, for up to 72 pediatric patient families each night, with children being treated at Primary Children's Hospital, the University of Utah, and Shriners. This project will create much needed backyard green space for our families, as well as qualitative programming space within the 2 beautiful historic homes for patients that reside with us temporarily. The green space will include a winding path, raised planters, flowers, natural and engaging critter rocks, maybe a spitting frog, a puppet stage, lots of room for children and families to run and play and relax and heal together. The 2 historic homes will be preserved and much more visible from the street, as they now cannot be seen. We have proudly been part of the Avenues community since 1988, when we opened the original Ronald McDonald House. We've worked to be good stewards of the gifts entrusted in us and worked to be good neighbors during that time. As a charity with limited resources, we work very hard to maintain our properties and to be an asset to this community. We believe this project will improve the neighborhood as we demolish the non-contributing medical office building at 24 M Street that was previously owned and operated as a sex offender treatment program, add green space as we remove the heat-producing asphalt in favor of a beautiful new private backyard for our guest families, and preserve the 2 historic homes with adaptive reuse for support groups for our families. The renovations of these homes will be focused on seismic upgrades, fire suppressant, sprinklers, and physical accessibility. This project is part of a $2.7 million Park That Love Built capital campaign that's been supported entirely by private charitable contributions. The park will be named in honor of O.C. Tanner, which has a long demonstrated history of bringing beauty, including extraordinary flower gardens and green spaces, to this state and our community. We do not anticipate negative impacts in terms of parking and traffic, as this is a qualitative improvement to the Ronald McDonald House to serve our existing families better rather than to bring additional families to our house. The project will increase available parking with 2 additional street parking stalls. As Amy mentioned, smoking will not be permitted on the green space. The exterior lighting in the green space will be low-level pathway lighting. The backyard green space will be secured with a fence and card key gate entrance. Our Ronald McDonald House is staffed 24 hours a day, every day of the year, with a nighttime security guard who regularly makes rounds around our property. There will be cameras installed and monitored on the property, and all guests and visitors to this green space must first check in at our front desk to obtain a VIN card access to the space. The green space will be closed at 9 o'clock every night. Our immediate neighbors will be notified of the demolition timeline. During construction, we will work hard to mitigate the disruption in the neighborhood to minimize the dust and the noise and the inconvenience. We're really excited to create a beautiful, inviting outdoor green space for the families we serve. We're delighted that this project will beautifully preserve and honor the 2 historic homes through adaptive reuse, and we believe it's going to improve our neighborhood and our community. It will also offer needed qualitative programming for the patient families that we host. We're grateful for the Avenues and Salt Lake communities that have proudly supported our mission for 30 years, and we appreciate your consideration of this project. The lot consolidation and conditional use are the first key steps in moving forward with the project. Thanks, and I'm glad to answer any questions.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you for all you do and your organization does for the community. I think you've addressed a lot of the concerns that I had, both the staff report and your presentation, with the smoking issues, the security issues. It's completely closed off. I think there was a letter that mentioned a restroom, which I assume would be in the space.
Inside
in
the 2
locked-
historic homes, so
Oh,
they'll
okay.
have accessible,
And
we're
all
not building a
that's-
new restroom.
And all that is locked off by the gate.
Absolutely.
So only
VIN
entrance
card
you'll have will be-
entry only.
Okay. And then the light you addressed. Did you address the sound? You got the
Yeah,
stage.
so the stage is intended to be a puppet stage, not like a Red Butte stage. So we often have magic shows or princess parties or pirate parties, and these volunteer groups come to host our families. They're small gatherings. They're not loud or disruptive, and so I don't anticipate anything being installed in terms of a sound system or any kind of projector. I think if we would just bring mobile whatever over there, and
You're not going to be the future venue of the Twilight
No.
concert series?
no,
Okay.
not
that's
our
good.
area.
That's good. Maybe a puppet version?
Uh-huh.
Give Snoop Dogg doing
Yes,
something up there? That would
yes.
be great. Any questions for the applicant or for staff before we open up the public hearing? Go ahead,
So
Marty.
do you have any concerns about what the conditions are that staff has suggested? Have they gone over those with you?
No, not at all, actually. I think it's all very reasonable. I think our intention is to create a fenced area and a gate that will exceed the 4-foot limit, but that's essential to ensure the security for the neighborhood and not to, I think, invite folks who might want to camp out. So
And
there are
that's-
some, we'll have to work through the HLC process
I
for
was gonna say,
those
that's another process.
special exceptions, minor alterations, which we're happy to do.
Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. We will go ahead and open up the public hearing on this item. I do not believe I received any cards for this item, but if anyone would like to speak on this item, now is your chance. Just come on up. Oh, starting with the Avenues Community Council, of course, if anyone is there here representing that organization. Any general public? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing on that. Any questions for staff, or do we have a motion?
I will make a motion.
Okay.
Based on the information in the staff report, the information presented, and the input received during the public hearing, I move that the Planning Commission approve conditional use petition PLN PCM 2018-00553 with the conditions listed in the staff report and associated lot consolidation PLN SUB 2018-00447.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion by Brenda and a second by Maureen. We'll go ahead and vote. Clark?
Aye.
Maureen?
Yes.
Brenda?
Yes.
And Amy?
Yes.
All right. Congratulations. I don't know where you went. There you are. Congratulations. Good luck with the Historic Landmarks Commission. All right, moving on to the next item. that I'm sure everybody is excited about. This is the Inland Port zoning modifications. Daniel and Tracy.
Hi there. So good evening, everybody. As you said, we are here to talk about the Inland Port zoning modifications. This is in response to the state bill that was passed in July of 2018. So I'm going to provide just a little bit of background, just some information on inland ports, our public engagement process, and then I'll turn it over to Daniel to talk about the details of the ordinance. So just to start off, I know some of you have already seen this, but just wanted to provide this for the public. So what is an inland port? So an inland port is an intermodal facility that's located inland of traditional coastal boundaries. It's usually intermodal because it involves either truck, train, or planes. These inland ports, they move goods in and out for distribution. That's kind of the main function of it. One of the big things with inland ports, it helps relieve congestion at the coastal ports. So what they do is they move this international freight efficiently by providing a customs clearance inland, so they don't have to all wait at the coastal port for the product to come in, and it kind of helps with the with all the ships that are waiting to unload. These are also commonly referred to as a dry port, a global trade port, a logistics park, or an intermodal facility. Typically, the functions of an inland port involve a rail line. So the rail line you see in the picture on the left, that's usually what people call the inland port. This is the rail lines that bring in the freight. This is where they would do the customs clearance. Also, as a part of that, there's large cranes on site that help move the freight from one mode of transportation to another. And typically around these inland ports, you have things such as warehousing, distribution centers, and manufacturing facilities that are located around that kind of benefit being in close proximity to these. They also allow for kind of temporary storage as they await distribution and are moved to the next spot. In terms of just overall benefits and drawbacks, in the benefits, we're looking at the efficiency in goods that can be moved quickly through train and the amount of goods that can be moved on the trains. So it saves time, there's a reduction in transportation costs, and it's also just a growing sector just due to globalization and the growth of e-commerce. In terms of the drawbacks, we're looking at kind of environmental impacts to air quality, water quality, habitat degradation. Also, there's concerns about demands on public utilities and infrastructure in general, and also impact on road infrastructure and transportation. So here's a couple examples of what inland ports look like. This is an example of the logistics park in Kansas City. This is located about 30 miles away from Kansas City. As you can see, the rail is centered here. It's a BNSF rail line, so this is where the actual inland port facility is. And then, as you can see around the area, you have a lot of warehousing. You have companies like Jet, Amazon, et cetera. So it's usually a lot of distribution centers that are kind of centered around these facilities. The other example is the Centerpoint Intermodal Center in Joliet, Illinois. This is about 50 miles away from Chicago. Again, this one's a little different. It actually has two different inland port kind of rail centers. There's a UP line here and a BNSF line here. And again, very similar. You start seeing a lot of kind of warehousing distribution centers that are kind of built around that. And that's typically what we see. It's a lot of kind of lighter industrial light manufacturing type uses. So in terms of the state bill HB 2001, this was passed in July 2018 by the state legislature. So what it says in the bill, it requires the municipality in which the jurisdictional land is located to make changes to the zoning by December 31st, 2018 to allow inland port uses as conditional or permitted uses. If we do not make changes by the state, anything that can be considered an inland port use would be a permitted use, and the city would basically lose the ability to regulate any type of inland port use. The bill, which is now state law, gives a pretty broad definition of inland port use. It describes an inland port use as a use for an inland port. but also provides a broad set of kind of objectives or goals that go along with that. It also states in that bill that you cannot prohibit, so a municipality cannot prohibit the unloading, loading, transfer, or temporary storage of natural resources. So that's another thing that we need to consider in writing this ordinance. One other aspect of the bill, it does allow us to add in some additional environmental standards. So that's one thing we're trying to achieve through this ordinance. So this is a map. So the area that's in the blue, within the blue dotted line, that's the Inland Port Authority jurisdictional area. As you can see in this map, so the black line is where the city boundary is. The majority of the land is within Salt Lake City. It's a total of about, so the entire jurisdictional area is about 16,000 acres, and most of it is in Salt Lake City. One thing to note, so the Inland Port Bill kind of describes this whole thing as an inland port. Typically, when you look at kind of the examples that we just went through, the inland port is actually just the rail facility that conducts the customs clearance and whatnot, but they have called this entire area, anything associated with the inland port, as the inland port. So overall, in the terms of the inland port policies and objectives, it does list a pretty long list of 15 items, but these ones are the ones related to zoning. So it does include things like respect and maintain the sensitivity to the unique natural environment and areas in proximity to the authority jurisdictional land. It talks about improving air quality and minimizing resource use. It talks about respecting existing land use and other agreements. It promotes and encourages the development of inland port lands. Talks about generating economic development and also supporting inland port uses for such as warehousing, light manufacturing, and distribution. So if you recall, just not too long ago, at the beginning of the year, we went through a series, or we went through a zoning amendment very similar to this, where we did go into our M1, or actually our M1 and manufacturing zones to make sure that what we have in those zones would be able to support inland port if they wanted to come. And as a part of those amendments, we addressed the railroad freight terminal. To refresh your memory, what we added in there was for it to have a 1 mile buffer from residential. And there was also a provision that existed previously that said railroad freight terminal couldn't be within 5 miles of another. So we made those tweaks. The only difference with that is we were looking at the manufacturing zones in the city, so it's everything in gray on this map. What the bill did was that it expanded that, so now it includes about 8 or 9 different zoning districts instead of just the one we were looking at. So this is kind of part of what we were trying to do. We need to make sure that we are able to allow inland port uses in this entire area. So our task is just develop zoning regulations to respond to the state bill, and we need to allow the inland port uses in the 8 zoning districts. And we also want to develop standards to mitigate any negative impacts of these inland port uses. And just wanted to mention some things that we can't control. There are some existing state and federal standards. We can't regulate like vehicle emissions. We're unable to, regulate like federal highways and railroads. We also can't control the Inland Port Authority. I know a lot of the comments are geared towards kind of the Inland Port Authority, how they're operating, things like that. That's a separate entity that's not related to these zoning changes, so we can't do anything through zoning through that. So anything that's not related to zoning, we're not addressing today. And it's important to note the Inland Port Authority, there isn't a specific plan yet for any port authority, or I'm sorry, port proposal that we're aware of. There's also not a business plan yet, so it's kind of moving in a backwards fashion. So this adds to kind of the challenge of writing an ordinance when we don't really know exactly what this Inland Port Authority wants to see out there. So just some things to keep in mind. In terms of public engagement, so over the course of about 6 weeks, we've notified all the community councils. We had mailings to every property and within 300 feet of this inland port jurisdictional area. There have been multiple email lists have been sent an email about all these public engagement events. We've worked with the civic engagement team at the city and worked with the social and pushed out some social media about it. We've presented at the Glendale Community Council a few weeks ago. We also held 3 open houses to get feedback and for people to respond to some of the ideas that we came up with. There's also a website where we try to keep up to date all the information related to these zoning amendments related to the inland port. There was also an online survey. We had over 480 respondents and over about 3,000 comments that were received through that. And then within your Dropbox, we actually got the survey, all the survey responses in there today. So in terms of timeline, everything in the light blue, we've kind of just wrapped up last week. We are in kind of the brighter blue now. It's a very quick process due to this December 31st timeline. So we had about 6 weeks to conduct all the public engagement and write an ordinance. And we will be having a planning or a public hearing tonight and on the 26th. And we're hoping to have a recommendation from Planning Commission at the next meeting so that this can go to City Council for their review and so that it can be adopted on time. So I'm going to turn it over to Daniel now, and he will kind of talk about the ordinance itself.
All right, so I'm going to go over what's kind of informing the proposal and the details of the ordinance, kind of the key components of the ordinance. What's informing the proposal is, first of all, the public comments. With those surveys, we got a lot of feedback. Primarily, it was about environmental concerns. Generally, those had to do with air quality, water quality, wildlife, ecosystems out there, the wetlands that are out there. Additionally, we also did get comments about traffic concerns, whether that be vehicles, private vehicles, or increased train traffic. Also informing the proposal is the goals and values of the city that are reflected in the adopted city master plans. Those include the Northwest Quadrant that was recently adopted, as well as Plan Salt Lake, which is our citywide master plan. So those have policies about environmental protection, including air and water quality, and they also include policies about economic development and balancing that out. Also informing the proposal is the Inland Port Authority legislation that actually has those specific environmental policies that Tracy listed. Some of those were improve air quality and also respect and maintain sensitivity to the unique natural environment. And additionally, there are requirements in that legislation that require us to allow certain uses, but still allow us to regulate them. So the approach we're taking is an overlay zoning approach. So this would create an overlay zone across all of the Inland Port Authority jurisdictional land, and we were calling it the IP Inland Port Overlay Zone. And that overlays all of the existing underlying zoning, some of that CG, OS, BP zoning, business park zoning. And it adds additional rules and regulations, but it does add additional allowances as far as the land uses go. It allows for all of the light industrial uses in any of the zones that it overlays. It also overrides any less restrictive rules and imposes higher standards. But the existing Northwest Quadrant regulations out there that generally dealt with environmental stuff, including native plants, natural area buffers, those would still remain in effect. So as far as the key regulations, the primary one is that it allows light industrial uses throughout this overlay, and it allows all the uses that are listed currently in our M1 light industrial zoning district. And examples of those are warehousing, industrial assembly, offices, light manufacturing uses. Generally, we found these to be inland port type uses. When we looked at other inland port examples, those were the sorts of light industrial uses that surround these facilities. Additionally, this would prohibit the intense heavy manufacturing uses that we don't generally see around inland ports. And these would include refineries, hazardous waste, material associated uses, and resource mining uses, among some others. And again, those are generally not inland port type uses. We didn't see these heavy uses around these inland port facilities. Additionally, we are requiring conditional use process for some of these more intense of the light industrial uses, and that include the railroad freight terminal, which is the inland port itself, outdoor recycling, stockyards, rock, sand, and gravel distribution, concrete manufacturing, auto salvage and recycling. These are fairly intense uses that could have impacts on air quality on adjacent properties. So we're requiring them to go through this conditional use process. And through the conditional use process, these uses are allowed, but they're subject to a special review for detrimental impacts. We identify the detrimental impacts and how they're going to mitigate it, and see if they are sufficiently going to mitigate detrimental impacts. And this is reviewed by staff, and then ultimately the decision is up to the Planning Commission. So as an additional component of this, we are requiring an impact mitigation plan for any of these conditional uses. And in that impact mitigation plan, you need to identify a specific plan as far as how you're going to mitigate any potential detrimental impacts that might come with some of these uses, including your specific proposed measures to mitigate these impacts. And as part of this, we're calling out specific categories of things that they need to identify, and this includes air and water quality impacts, traffic, transportation impacts, public utility impacts, energy and water consumption impacts, wetland and wildlife impacts, public safety, and generally any impacts to surrounding properties. So we're using this process. It does capture a broad variety of potential impacts and concerns, and that allows us flexibility in identifying issues that we may not currently anticipate because we don't know exactly what this facility will look like or what these uses will look like. So it kind of captures any of these broad potential impacts. And additionally, it does allow for some creativity as far as mitigation for any negative impacts that might be identified. And again, this would be...
A quick question
Go
for
ahead.
you. Can you explain or clarify, so reading through these documents, you seem to say that you're not able to restrict things like air regulation or air quality or transportation because those are state or federal laws attached to that. But then your plan is that you can require them to do a study to what are the impacts of those things, and then they have to show that they're going to mitigate them somehow, even though you can't really regulate it.
So there's certain parts of air quality impacts that we can't regulate, and that generally has to do with the vehicles themselves, because there's federal regulations. So vehicles that are traveling in and out of this facility, we couldn't really regulate those. If there's specific on-site sources that aren't moving anywhere, we could potentially ask for mitigation for those. So we are somewhat limited just because of those regulations. But like building impacts due to air quality or on-site generators, those things that we could look at.
And are those, part of the regulations, are there standards for those impacts that we review as a conditional use? So we say, yes, it passes that, or doesn't pass that?
There's not a tight standard. It's more of a general review for these.
For example, you're saying you can't regulate the vehicles going in and out of the port, but you could say there is going to be an impact on those from those vehicles coming in and out. Then are we just stuck with that, or how is that mitigated?
As far as their those particular vehicle emissions go, we may be limited as far as what we can ask them to do. Mm-hmm.
Or the associated increase in traffic from those vehicles.
So as far as traffic goes, they do have to identify their potential impacts, and we can ask for specific improvements to the roadways to mitigate any traffic impacts. So that is one area we can specifically ask for, and that's something that transportation actually does ask for with some intense uses. We make them do a traffic impact study. They tell us how much they're impacting intersections or roadway level of service, and then they can ask for improvements.
So the roads can be improved, but everybody has to deal with the increase in truck traffic, especially if they live out there. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Just trying to get clarification. So the same goes with trains, right? I mean, you're saying that you guys can do an impact study, they can improve things, but everybody has to kind of live with more trains.
Yes.
Where the city,
we-
I mean, you know, what the city can look at in those situations is, yeah, we can't, you know, regulate the number of trains that would come in per that use, but what we can do is look at ways to potentially try to mitigate impacts. So if there's particular railroad crossings that may need to be improved because of the amount of trains, that's the type of stuff that we can look at.
Is there a way to require the port to maybe build dedicated roads that others don't use as much, or build overpasses, or require money to do those types of things?
These are great questions that we wish we had the answers for right now, but it's a lot of unknowns at the moment.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry for the digression, but it
That's
felt
all right.
an appropriate time to ask questions.
So again, all these things would be reviewed by staff and then sent to the commission for your review as well, and your final decision on those. The other key component of these regulations is the natural resources component. The state bill did require the city to allow natural resource loading, unloading, transfer, and the temporary storage of natural resources. But they didn't prohibit us from regulating that. So allow, but regulate. So we are requiring these sort of uses to do the impact mitigation plan and the conditional use process. But because we know there are some specific potential impacts that would come with these natural resource storage, we are proposing some specific standards. And these include walls up to the height of the material to prevent any dust, fugitive dust, and air quality impacts. Solid surfaces for the storage so that drainage issues are prevented for as far as water quality impacts go. We're also requiring other dust control measures to mitigate fugitive dust when they're loading and unloading. And we're also requiring a 1,000-foot buffer from any residential zone. And examples of these materials include sand, dirt, grains, logs, fertilizer, wood chips. We are imposing additional regulations on coal byproducts, and crude oil because we know those even have more specific potential impacts. So those must be within a completely enclosed building, or alternatively, they may be stored within a rail car if that rail car is covered or it is sprayed with a surfactant to reduce the potential for any sort of dust from that storage. And again, this would have to be located a minimum of 1,000 feet from any residential zone or environmentally sensitive area, and that would include identified wetlands. And because the state bill didn't require permanent storage of these, we are defining the temporary storage as limited to 30 days. So those are the key highlights of the proposal. And I did want to stress that since we are on a tight timeline, we're happy to take requests for additional research, but because we only have 2 weeks before the next meeting, we may be limited as far as what we can get to. We're going to try to get to everything. So if we're not able to get everything, we ask that you add a condition maybe to your recommendation at the next meeting, so we can follow that up with City Council.
Gotcha.
So with that.
Where does the 1,000 feet limit come from? Seems like I'd heard earlier talks of at least a mile.
The mile came with the freight terminals themselves. There was, I think, a few studies that showed that the mile was the cutoff for the air quality impacts from that sort of use specifically.
Yeah, that was a policy recommendation from one of the studies they did on one of the California ports. So it just recommended that it be buffered at least a mile from residential.
And these other uses are generally the dust itself rather than the other sort of emissions. And so 1,000 feet generally has been the standard when we've dealt with those uses in the past. We actually have a 1,000-foot limit for some of these uses already in the M1 zone.
So the actual language here talks about conditional uses, and first of all, I want to clarify where a conditional use would be review would be required. And so what I'm thinking you're saying is that anywhere that's already an M1 zone it probably would not be required, except for a couple of things like the heavier, what you're calling a heavier use, or a natural resource storage, loading, et cetera. So those two
Yes.
within the M1 zone, and then anything that's not already an M1 zone now would be a conditional use.
Though anything that's not listed right now, it could go through an administrative interpretation process, and we could find that it's similar to a use that we allow. But if there's another use proposed that isn't listed in our land use table and isn't close to one of those uses, we're not allowing it.
So within the commercial area, for example,
Yeah.
if it's not listed in that, then it would be a conditional use.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So there's those circumstances where a conditional use would be required. And the way that City Planning Commission works is that we have a conditional use process where we have particular standards that a conditional use has to meet to be approved. And if it does meet those standards, then it must be approved. So, but what you're giving us here is not a standard like that. Is that correct? I mean, because right here, all they're having to do as a standard is to actually produce a mitigation plan.
So they would have to go through both things, the conditional use process, and they would have to comply with all of the conditional use standards, but they would also have to comply with all of these additional standards as well, where we're more specific about the potential impacts that these uses could have. And they would have to show us exactly how they're going to mitigate these and put that in their building plans.
One of the conditional use standards, for example, is that, basically the world is better off with this use rather than another use. And so that would be a reason to turn it down?
That's not a conditional use standard, that's a plan development
Okay.
standard.
So give me an example of a conditional use
So
standard.
actually, and it's, one of the main clumps of standards for a conditional use discusses detrimental impacts.
Right.
And we've really actually tried to tie this mitigation plan into, to our standards already for the detrimental impacts. So some of the standards that you address as part of a conditional use is utility capacity is sufficient to support the use at normal service levels. The use meets the sustainability plans and does not significantly impact the quality of the surrounding air and water, et cetera. So what we wanted to do with this is actually require, as part of the process, a good study so that it gives you the information that you could actually answer these questions and answer to these standards.
That's great, and I really think that's a terrific way. Thank you for answering that. That's a major clarification that we need in these documents too, because I think people don't understand that the conditional use process has its own set of standards that we use to determine whether or not something passes a conditional use. So the mitigation plan is actually the data that we would use in order to determine whether the conditional use has been fulfilled or not.
Correct.
So
Yeah, that's a big part of the conditional use is yeah, you almost have to approve them. The only way you can deny a conditional use is if there's impacts that can't be mitigated. So a big part of this, obviously called mitigation plan, is that the impacts, the potential impacts are identified, and then it's on the developer to determine ways and best management practices and so on to actually mitigate those impacts. And
What
that's
if a
something-
developer comes back and says, look, it's impractical for me to mitigate all of the air pollution or all of the water pollution for this particular use I'm trying to put in a conditional use?
We can deny it
Does
then.
the planning commission then have the authority to say, sorry?
Yeah, if it's not sufficiently mitigated, we can use that as our reason to deny.
And who gives us that data? Is there a third-party organization that would measure that? Or do we?
One thing that we wrote in the ordinance specifically is that the planning director has the authority to request a third-party review. So if something comes in, I mean, we don't have, the planning staff doesn't have the technical expertise to measure air quality and that type of thing. So we put in the ordinance that we have the ability to send it out for a third-party review, to have experts review that. Another thing that we need to just kind of key in on, and this is going to come up throughout even future process, is that as part of the bill, there's a special appeal process that has been built into this. Something that we all need to be aware of, because typically the appeal process for a planning commission decision like a conditional use, if a developer or a property owner does not like a decision by the planning commission, that appeal would go through our internal appeal hearing officer. And then if your decision is upheld and they want to continue, it would actually go to third district court at that point in time. With this law, they have set up a different appeal system. And basically what would happen is after it goes through our internal appeal, it doesn't go to court, it actually goes to this Inland Port Appeal Authority, who has the option of overturning our decisions related to land use based on a pretty broad spectrum, or pretty broad standard. So it's just, it's part of, it's kind of the hand we're dealt with right now. And so I wanted to bring that up because that's going to, weigh in a little bit on
Do
our
we know
future
what those
decisions.
standards are, Wayne? Have they been written?
We do, it's in the law, and we could pull that up and let you know what those, it's basically says, there's a whole list of kind of goals for the inland port area. It's a long list of goals for the inland port, and, one of the standards was a condition or a decision made by, in our case, the planning commission, not consistent with the goals of the inland port. It's that broad.
So one could say that all of these intense environmental requirements and regulations might not ever, might be part of the intent of the inland port.
Yeah,
These decisions might be congruent with the inland port's intents.
we'll have to wait and see how that.
Okay.
And that's why I think anything we can do to, I think our goal would be, and I think you've done this, and I'm hoping to hear from the public as possibly some more ideas, but to use this process to bring up data and bring up information so that then there is the public pressure and the public knowledge that, I think that's our best weapon to use in the process when it gets to the Port Authority, because that's all we have once it's out of our hands. And if they appeal it all the way there, then that's all we got. So through this process, any way we can force digging up information and forcing that transparency before it gets there, that's kind of my goal here. And I think you've done a lot with that. And I think that, that component of third-party data gathering, I think is vital to
100% agree.
Yeah, to just force the hand and provide that information. So once it gets to the Port Authority, they can't ignore it. They can't ignore it because the legislature in their wisdom said they can. But anyway, any other comments?
That's why it's
To
so
be done.
important, because they can ignore it, but if there's an actual study out there that's legitimate and people can fight against it, then it makes it harder.
Exactly.
And it's certainly a different situation than when, we have a bar going into a neighborhood and everybody in the neighborhood complains about parking. And yeah, maybe that's going to impact the neighborhood, but the bar says, well, we're going to do this and we're going to do that and it's going to be okay. And we take them at their word. We don't require them to go out and do a traffic study, but in this case, we can and we should absolutely require those things to be done.
Well, we can only do it for those conditional uses, so we must remember that. We're not, there are going to be, I would say, many, many uses going into the inland port area that will not require a conditional use process, right?
Right.
Do we have any estimates of that, or just mostly in all of the areas? We don't know what they're going to do, right?
As far as the
okay.
mix goes, yeah, I don't know.
Any other questions before we?
Yeah, I have a
go?
few.
Okay, go for
God,
it.
I feel like my microphone is
All right.
really amplified.
I think you may have turned it off.
Sorry. I have some follow-up questions along those lines. So when you talk about, well, first off, I want to say that was a really great presentation. I appreciate the absolute untenable position that the whole staff has been in, and you did a really wonderful job of encapsulating it very well. So in my notes, you talked about the impact mitigation plan with the conditional use. And I guess I wonder, is the same standard going to be used for this as we use for our regular developments if they've done something reasonable, which is this really nebulous term? Is that going to be the same litmus test?
As far as the conditional use goes, it does have standards that say that the mitigation has to be reasonable. It does. But that is up to the commission to decide whether that is reasonable or not. Yeah.
Yeah, I always struggle with that one on everything, so I wanted to know if we were going to get any more clarity, but I guess not. And then this is the Northwest Quadrant Master Plan was prior to me, so you're going to be educating me a little bit. But you had mentioned in your presentation that you looked at, because this is an overlay with those goals, and I was wondering, did the Northwest Quadrant process and what was eventually passed, did they look and identify to all of these environmental concerns, or was it just this broad, we want to protect the environment, or did it list them out? Because you mentioned you would be looking at, that you looked at that when you created this, and I just wanted to understand better what was in the Northwest Quadrant Master Plan.
So the Northwest Quadrant Master Plan is a very high level, kind of 30,000 foot level vision and goals for the area. So it talks about kind of balancing basically economic development and preserving kind of important sensitive lands. So there's the areas that are near the Great Salt Lake it's part of an international migratory bird flyway, and they're very important nesting areas and things like that. So yeah, it talks about kind of general goals of making sure that we help preserve that environment, but also allow for economic development to happen. With the master plan, we also went through a series of zoning amendments. So through that, we created the Northwest Quadrant overlay. So we actually have designated.
Oh, it was an overlay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we've actually designated in the area north of I-80. We've kind of specified 3 different areas: a natural area, like a buffer area, and a development area. So anything in that natural area is not developable. And
Is any of those natural areas within this?
it's not. So that's
Okay.
one thing with the bill that they actually took that area out.
Okay.
So let's see. So the natural area is actually all of this area here. And this was removed from the.
And that was
jurisdiction.
identified in the Northwest Quadrant overlay?
Correct.
Okay. Oh, that's helpful, thank you. And then one of my other follow-up questions, Daniel, you brought up the natural resource component regarding the impact mitigation. And so I guess I'm wondering where all of these were taken. So you talked about this 1,000-foot buffer that it exists in some other zones that Salt Lake City has. Did you look at other areas, other inland ports, or other standards for type of mitigation that were meeting specific environmental standards that would be mitigating these type of activities? Or did we just look at what's already in our zoning?
We looked at a variety of different zones in place for other inland ports. A lot of them had general standards. Some of them had general buffers, but they weren't exactly directed at natural resource storage itself. Natural resource storage is kind of unique as far as it being called out in this bill, and us needing to respond particular to that. I think we did try to look up what standard buffers might be. I don't know that we found a great
There's nothing out
clear
there by
standard that says this is
other
where the dust
organizations?
ends.
Well, there wasn't anything out there by other
We can do
organizations
some more
produced?
research. I'm not sure that we ran into.
Yeah, I obviously can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I just
Yeah.
wanted to know kind of the breadth of where you were able to get some of this data
Yeah.
to come up with a proper buffer. And if it was solely just looking at what we've allowed, and maybe there's other data out there that other groups, a third-party organization perhaps has done some studies
Yeah.
that
no-
tackle this, and maybe that's a complete empty black hole you could be falling in, but
We can definitely look into that and see if we can find some specific studies about where that dust may drop off, odors may drop off, and that.
yeah. Okay,
Yep.
thank you. Those were what I've written down.
So you said that you showed us 2 other inland ports. How many inland ports are there in the United States?
I don't know the exact number, but there are quite a few. We'd have to kind of maybe look that up.
Okay, do we have any idea why this one would be so popular that we would want to support it?
I think it's the location. So there's a lot of the rail coming from California, and then Midwest. Salt Lake is kind of the crossroads of the West. So again, it's a pretty ideal spot for to allow for. I can't remember the time it takes to get from California to Utah on train, but it's an ideal time, like midpoint to stop from between California and the Midwest.
Have you found any other inland ports that are within 4 or 5 miles of the center of the city?
I don't have the exact
Yeah.
measurements for how far each of those was from a city. No.
Speaking of the one in Chicago being 50 miles and the one in wherever, Kansas, 40
Yeah.
miles or something. So
Some of them had a sprinkling of suburbs next to them. So I
Right.
think there was a mix, really.
But, this one is, we're actually not that well served by rail currently, I don't think, because it's hard to get over the mountains from California. But we are very well served by trucking and obviously planes. So I'm just wondering about the particular location of this in terms of its impact on a built-up city. And so I know that this isn't our question per se, but in terms of those impacts are even more impactful, let's say, because we are within 4 to 5 miles of, within a mile of, actual residential properties. So the other question I have is about the prison. Could you point out the prison location on this map, please?
Right over here.
So it is within the inland port area.
Yes.
And do we call the prison population residential?
We haven't yet in this ordinance. We have been considering what buffer may be appropriate. We're kind of in possibly an awkward position because the prison is a state facility and the state is asking us to allow these uses in this area. So we'd be imposing a buffer on a state facility itself. That being said, we have had discussions about whether we should impose a buffer on this, and I think we're open to considering putting a buffer from the prison like we have from residential uses.
So do we have any, and when we talk about a transportation impact, if employees for these great new jobs can't actually reach it by in any way except through a private vehicle, is that one of the impacts that we're looking at?
I don't know if we called that out exactly.
Yeah, I think it's focused on just like the roads and.
It would be insofar as the number of vehicles that would be vehicle traffic generated by these when there's not any bus service. So we would be looking at that. There probably would be a greater impact on the roads if there's no bus service out there. So we could ask for road improvements. We could potentially ask them as an alternative to work with UTA on some sort of transportation.
Because it seems like one of the major environmental impacts would be all these cars, you know, and also it's a social impact in that many people who would be able to take the jobs, presumably good-paying jobs, in warehouses and so forth, might not have access to a vehicle. Is that the kind, are we looking at any kind of social impacts at all?
I think I think all the impacts that we've identified through the mitigation plan are all social impacts. And there is a transportation impact study required. It does get a little difficult you know, I don't think we can like hold up a project until bus service is put out there. But one of the responsibilities of the Inland Port Authority is that they have to come up with a business plan for this area. And that's one of the things that I think that we've seen as a benefit of this process. There's only so much we can do with zoning. But we've been using this process as to try to, you know, as an educational process, as well as a means to get public involvement and public comments that we could then pass along to our city council and to the state. I think that's a place where we really, as a city and as a community, wanted to make sure that we continue to be involved in this Inland Port Authority, are these types of issues right here, where if we're going to do something like this out here, then money needs to be put in place to increase transportation options and things of that nature. And that's something that needs to happen at the state level.
Anything else, Brenda? Anything else right now? Okay. Thank you. And I guess we don't have anyone else to speak on it other than the public, right? Okay. All right, so we'll go ahead and open the public hearing on this. I know that this is what most of you want to speak to. Obviously, you all know the situation we're in. Thank you to the staff who has worked incredibly hard to deal with what they were handed. And we're going to continue that. And I hope the understanding here is that this is required by law to go through. And so it is the best thing we can do now is figure out how to lessen the impact on our quality of life here in the city and in the community. So hopefully you all have some great ideas that we can add to this. I'm going to start with the cards. And if you didn't have a chance to give a card, that is fine. I will come to you as well. You have 2 minutes to speak, and that's just so that we can get through everybody as quickly as possible. And it will not be an interactive thing. We'll be taking notes and listening, and staff will be listening. So that's how we're going to be taking this in. And, you know, it's if you can not be super repetitive with what other people are saying, that's also helpful. And limiting your comments to what we have authority over is also incredibly helpful as well. But the 2 minutes is yours. So we will start. I guess there's no community council out in the Northwest Quadrant. Not yet. Is there? Who is that? Absolutely. Are you it? Would you like to speak as the you get more time as our community council representative? Speaking on behalf of the community, you will have 5 minutes. So come on up and...
I don't know if I'll take the whole 5 minutes.
That's okay. You don't have to. Just make sure you sit first and give us your name into the microphone so we have it on the record, and speak into the microphone.
Now, the Utah State Legislature gave me 60 seconds, so I am most impressed. And
We're very nice here.
They made me include my name in passing it, and they couldn't find the paper I passed out either, and that was part of it.
Okay.
My name is Dorothy Pappas Owen. I am the chair of the West Point Community Council. There are 3 community councils that cover the Inland Port Authority jurisdiction area. West Point and Jordan Meadows are on the north side and cover that area, and Poplar Grove is on the south side of I-80, and it's the 3 of us that cover that area. And we have been working together on these issues, and we've also been working with the other 3 West Side community councils. So there's actually 6 community councils that have been working closely on this, and we've actually created a West Side Coalition organization that meets every 2 weeks to deal with this and other issues. West Point and Jordan Meadows go all the way roughly from Redwood Road all the way to the border of Salt Lake City. So West Point is the home of the Utah State Prison, as well as much of the Inland Port area. Jordan Meadows actually would be home of the actual freight terminal, if it's where we think it's going to be. And we have the airport in our area also. But so with that, I was here 6-7 months ago with a number of other people here talking about zoning for the Northwest Quadrant. And at that time, the Planning Commission was reviewing the zoning changes, did not want to take any specific recommendations at that time, but made a number of suggestions to the City Council. As a result of those suggestions, we took note of those, and all 3 of the community councils and a number of other entities in the area met. There was 19 of us who met. That included the landowners, Rio Tinto and Colmena. They were also part of this group of 19. And we went over the recommendations of the Planning Commission at that time and came up with unanimous agreement on 2 changes. And that's reflected in our letter. I believe that of those 2 changes, and they were the ones that were unanimous, so those are the ones we included. We approached the City Council with it. The City Council had us speak. The City Council said, we hear you, but this is just too politically sensitive. We're not going to make any changes. We are now 7 months later, and we are hoping at this point that we have a much more positive experience going through the zoning process. We believe that the 2 things that we had included there were clearly not controversial. We're unanimous in agreement whether you were a huge international multi-company like Rio Tinto, or you're a person like me that lives 5 minutes walk from my house to the border of the inland port. Or if you basically were part of the environmental groups, we all agreed on this. So we hope that you will include both of those recommendations in your final decisions here. The one that's the most important is the 1-mile buffer around the Utah State Prison. The Utah State Prison is going to be the largest residential facility within West Point. It will be the largest employer in West Point. It will be the home of probably the largest single volunteer force within West Point Community Council area. So that is how we as the citizens view it. We have been working closely with the Department of Corrections to talk to them about how the people who live in the area could be employed at the facility, at the correctional facility. We think that would be not only good public policy because we would have a much more diverse workforce, which we desperately need at the Utah State Prison, but we would also be limiting commuting times if we were able to use that. So we see this as a major employer. West Point Community Campus just opened. We are going to be working with them to develop training for jobs, and so we want to see that also in that. So With that, I hope that you will consider changing the buffer on that. And finally, I just want to say that you all know that trust is a huge issue, and we basically have great regard for the Planning Commission, and we trust that no matter how awkward you may feel at times on some of these decisions, that you will always ask, is this good public policy? And that question be what guides your actions. And as a public, as the citizens, the residents, we are going to have your back. Thank you.
Can I ask you a quick question before you go? I'm just curious about your grain silo and railroad repair suggestion.
Wait, Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
For the benefit of the record and the people in the audience, can you read those 2 points in the letter?
Sure.
Everyone's aware?
The first one is the provision prohibiting, as was mentioned, a railroad freight terminal within 1 mile of residential areas needs to include a similar 1 mile buffer around the new Utah State Prison. And then the second suggestion is if grain silos and railroad repair shops are to be included under M1 zoning, they should be included as conditional uses rather than permitted ones. And I was just curious as to what specifically, why you felt that those should be as a conditional rather than permitted. I don't know. I don't even know if those are. They are in M1. Yeah. So what was? Oh, they are conditional. Oh, they're not conditional. They're currently permitted.
And
So
will
what
they be
was?
permitted with the overlay?
We haven't proposed as of right now changes to that, but we're taking comments in.
So that's what, okay, and it was not clear to me, and so what I'm proposing is that, what we had proposed at the time was that the railroad repair shop should be a conditional use. And the reason why is you will never have a railroad repair shop without an inland port approval, an inland port freight terminal. An inland port freight terminal is a conditional use. This railroad repair shop is really just part of the inland port freight terminal, and we should be consistent that both of them are conditional uses and should be approached that way and and the mitigating factors should be applied to both.
And then grain silos. I'm not up on my reading on grain silos, so I'm not exactly sure what they would be, what the detrimental impact might be. So
I think I'd hold that question for somebody who has a little bit more expertise with the environment and the bird habitats and the migration patterns and that.
Okay.
But as you can see from the 19 people that signed, everybody agreed on those two things.
Yeah.
And I think under normal circumstances, they would have been approved in February. And again, if the question had been asked, what is good public policy? I think they would have been approved, and that's what we're asking for now.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. All right, to our cards. We will start with Dita Seed, and then after Dita, we will have Jack Ray. So just so you can get yourself mentally ready for your 2 minutes. Hello, Dita.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for caring about this issue. Obviously, we're in a terrible position. This is a terrible idea. It's not thought out at all. I shouldn't say I'm Dita Seed. I work with the Coalition for Port Reform and the Center for Biological Diversity. And I've been working on this issue for the last 6 months, basically as an organizer, and I've been researching ports. But just a couple things. One, stay tough on this, and I think you are asking the right questions. I mean, you are kind of our front line on this issue, sort of the last defense we have. And I think if we hold true to our community values and really test the Port Authority, that's going to be a good thing, and we should do that. And I think the ordinance that was drafted is a step in the right direction. I agree that there should be a 1 mile buffer for the prison. The other thing I want, and I think we have a whole bunch of folks from Audubon that are going to talk about bird conservation issues, and I endorse every single thing that they say in advance of them saying it. And then the other thing is, with regard to the natural resources storage issue, my research is showing that you can't cover coal. So I would just flag that for you. Coal is combustible. And so this talk about, oh, well, we can store coal and we're going to cover it, I think that's a little misleading. I mean, hopefully there will be no coal there. And, you know, our organizing effort is designed in a lot of ways to do what you've been talking about in terms of creating more transparency and good information and data about what's being proposed. Because as everyone's pointed out, we have no idea what this thing is going to be. They haven't told us, and I don't think they know. The linchpin of, that might not be the right word, but what makes it a port, as the planners have stated, is the rail yard. And so I think that's the thing that we really need to watch. And as it stands right now, the rumor mill suggests that BNSF wants to build the rail yard on the old landfill that's out there, with a piece of land owned by Rio Tinto. So that's just something to look out for. But thank you for what you're doing, and we'll be back.
Thank you. All right, Jack Ray, and then we have Wayne Martinson.
Thank you for this opportunity. I'm with the Utah Waterfowl Association, and I'd like, first of all, to thank the members of the planning staff for the hard work they've put into developing this ordinance on such short notice and with so little time within which to do it. There are a few things. I'm sure you've all heard of the importance of the Great Salt Lake wetlands, and specifically we're dealing here with the South Shore and the role it plays in, you know, critical, really, hemispheric migratory bird habitat. What's less well understood is that those wetland complexes used to extend all the way east to Beck Street, roughly, and all the way south to about 2500 south. So what we have left is really the core wetlands that have existed after, you know, 100 years of draining and development. So it's really important that we preserve those areas. The other thing is that those areas have been preserved to this point largely because of the perseverance of the people who own that land and who've managed it for over 100 years now. Those owners, I'm sure, simply want to make sure that those habitats, those sensitive areas, remain intact and undiminished for, you know, another 100 years in perpetuity. So as I've looked at the ordinance, I have just a few minor comments that I would suggest to assist in that process of making sure that the port development doesn't diminish the values of the surrounding areas. In section D2 and D2B2, there is the phrase abutting properties. In the statute, it refers, the phraseology used is areas in proximity. I would suggest that the phrase abutting properties be replaced with the statutory language areas in proximity, which is somewhat broader and fulfills the objective, I believe, both of Salt Lake City and of the legislature, that those sensitive landscapes be taken into consideration and preserved. The second suggestion would be that as regards natural resource storage, there's a 1,000-foot buffer around several types of sensitive areas, and those areas are delineated. I would suggest that in addition to those areas, the natural area that's already been designated in the Northwest Quadrant overlay be included as an area that's appropriate to have that 1,000-foot zone in which natural resource storage does not take place. Finally, the mitigation plan has 9 requirements that the developer needs to set out and explain in terms of how those impacts are going to be mitigated. There's one other one that I would suggest be added, and that also is taken from the statutory language. And that would be a description of how the development and uses are compatible with or complement uses in areas in proximity to the authority jurisdictional land. I think it's important that in developing those areas, the uses be compatible with and consistent with the legacy uses that are occurring on lands to the west and north of the inland port and that have been occurring there for well over 100 years. And again, that language is taken directly from the statute, so I believe it's consistent both with state policy and intent as well as hopefully with the intent of the city.
Thank you very much. Wayne Martinson, and then Terry Marcasco, I think.
Hi, I'm Wayne Martinson. I'm a member of the Conservation Committee for Great Salt Lake Audubon, and we've submitted a letter. I first of all want to say I wholly endorse what Dorothy Owen said, and part of what we sent was a letter endorsing those two comments that Dorothy made. And I also wholly support what Jack Ray just offered as 3 amendments that he'd want to see in the context here. I worked for National Audubon for 25 years, and we worked diligently to get this buffer going, and to preserve that. It's terrific, and it looks like it's there, and Jack's comments can do that. I want to speak just briefly to the prison. There is the 1 mile buffer that would be is needed for the railroad freight terminal. If you have a 1 mile buffer for residents, prisoners live out there full-time. They have less capacity to move than people choosing to live in a home. To not provide a buffer the same as residents is inhumane, is an environmental injustice that I think should not be can go forward any further, and you should put that in. There is the 1,000-foot buffer for the storage areas and the other aspect, and we in our letter said that anything where you have the residents with a particular buffer, you should also have the same buffer for the prison, at least that. So there's the 1 mile buffer, and then in the current things that you're reviewing, there would be the 1,000-foot buffer. There is a letter that the Utah Prisoner Advocate Network sent, which supports that, giving a little bit more detail about how important it is to have the same kind of buffer for residents. And just to comment, it is sobering to think about where we are now compared to 3 years ago or a couple of years ago, and what this inland port is going to do to the area. And I really appreciate what the city's been doing and the ordinances that you're trying to pass to make this somewhat bearable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, Terry Marcasco, and then Nigel Sewalls. I'm so sorry. You know who I'm talking about, I hope. All right, Terry, come on up.
I'll wait till they say something.
Okay, great. Let's go with Nigel then, and then we'll go with Dr. Heidi Horan after Nigel. I'm sorry about your last name, Nigel.
Swaby.
Okay.
Hard. There's 2 ways that it can go. I am Nigel Swaby. I'm the chair of the River District Chamber. We represent businesses in the area, including the inland port. We go from 23rd North to 21st South, west of 4th West. We have recently submitted a letter to the Planning Department concerning 4 zoning issues, and I wanted to present those to you today. The first is a landscaping overlay. We would like to see any landscaping that occurs there be as natural as possible, so we're not trying to grow sod on sand. Second would be pavement restrictions to address water displacement. These are going to be large buildings, lots of concrete, lots of asphalt, and we'd like to see anything that can be mitigated to allow free water flow. The third would be some sort of incentives of buildings to foster energy consumption and even energy production for surrounding neighborhoods. These are massive buildings. The plans that I've seen are a minimum of 500,000 square feet, with many of the buildings being 1 million square feet. And the last thing we'd like to see addressed, and this is probably the most important in terms of business and the community, is railroad traffic. I've seen, I know that Colmina's plan is to have a rail hub built in there, and they don't foresee any eastern rail traffic from their portion of the port, but I don't know what the other plans are going to be, especially over time. There are already issues in the area that we represent with existing rail traffic, with stoppages that create delays, create a lot of problems in the community and for operating businesses. So we would like to see something that would address that in the future. Thank you for your time. We're definitely encouraged by the current draft of the zoning ordinance, particularly the conditional use.
Great. Thank you so much. And good timing. All right, Dr. Heidi Horan?
Hoven.
I was going to guess that the second try. I'm
That's
sorry.
okay, I have bad handwriting. I am a wetland ecologist, and I have conducted research and conservation efforts out around Great Salt Lake wetlands for the last 20 years. I'm currently with National Audubon Society. I, along with Heather Dove, the president of Great Salt Lake Audubon, submitted comments August 31st, in which we wrote, "We would like to see the Port Authority push for industry standards that raise the bar toward environmental and human protections such that they incentivize implementation of new technologies that reduce carbon emissions as well as noise, water, light, and other air pollutants." And we're pleased to see that the proposed zoning modifications reflect this. Why is Great Salt Lake so important? There's millions upon millions of birds that migrate through twice a year. They rest, they nest, they breed. It is incredible. And just as an example, it has the world's largest assemblage of nesting snowy plovers, world's largest staging concentrations of Wilson's phalaropes, and others. I'd like to see added to the Section D, number 2B, the impact mitigation plan, et cetera, a wildlife corridor impact study and proposed mitigation relative to fencing. Pronghorn herds live out there, and they are currently becoming separated by fencing that is just placed along one road so far. Artificial light impact study and proposed mitigation relative to migrating birds. 2/3 of the birds' populations migrate at night. They become disoriented, confused, they collide and fall to their death because of artificial night light pollution. I'd like to see a recommended location of the heavy use, conditional use M2 industrial or disruptive M1 uses further than 1,000 feet from the wetlands and wildlife habitat of Great Salt Lake and closer to I-80 and of course away from human populations. I'd also like to see restricted mosquito abatement applications to no more than current applications within 1,000 feet of wetlands of the natural area and out toward Great Salt Lake. Mosquito larvae are important bird food, as are non-target species of midges that are even bigger and higher in protein, and that's what the birds are coming for. Many studies have shown detrimental effects on these from pesticides. In closing, I respectfully request that the Planning Committee favorably endorses a well-thought-out ordinance that allows conditional uses relevant for the operation of an inland port, but carefully discerns environmental impacts to the surrounding wildlife habitat and people, and mandates mitigative actions that lessen impacts to the extent possible by modern technology and leverages this inland port as exemplary nationwide and possibly globally. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hoven. Heather Dove. And I didn't tell you before, I'm sorry. And then after that is David Shear. After Heather. But I don't see Heather coming up. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Heather Dove. I'm president of Great Salt Lake Audubon. Heidi and Wayne have already brought up a number of the points that I was going to bring up, but I will say that we're very appreciative that the natural spaces and the buffers were honored in the Northwest Quad Master Plan and in the inland port, but we're still really concerned about the environmental impacts to the birds and to the people of this valley. We would like to encourage the planning office, as they're continuing to draft the zoning changes, that they include mitigation for noise pollution, light pollution, and collision hazards. You asked about the silos. The problem with the silos is they're very tall, and this whole port is sitting right in the flight path of these birds coming in to use the lake. And if they're not marked properly, we're going to have a lot of bird mortalities with collisions. Also, the only other point I wanted to make tonight is that we think that in the zoning plan that's being prepared, that there is a specific statement in there that if the land use applicant's mitigation plan is inadequate, if it's not considered up to standard, that it be disallowed. There's nothing in there right now that actually states what happens if the mitigation plan is not adequate. And that's it. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you so much. I'm finishing up my notes from your presentation. Okay. All right. David, you're up. And then after is Tom McLaughlin.
Evening. My name is David Shear. I've spoken to you a few times on behalf of the Capitol Hill Neighborhood Council, of which I'm a board member, but I'm tonight here just as a professional architect and planner. I'm very heartened by the discussion of standards that I heard earlier. These are critical. I agree with the comments to the effect that this ordinance is our last best hope for having some control over what happens in the inland port and allowing Salt Lake City to fulfill its duty to safeguard the health, safety, and welfare of its residents. I've reviewed the ordinance. I want to begin also by thanking and expressing my appreciation for the planning staff who've done an incredible job of pulling together a comprehensive ordinance on an inhumanly short timeline. I'd like to suggest 6 modifications here that I think would strengthen the ordinance by providing concrete standards which projects must meet, which would facilitate life for the applicants, and also make life easier for those who need to evaluate whether a project meets certain conditional use requirements. So I'm going to read these fast. I have a copy for you. Section D, 2B3, consider specifically including noise and light pollution. There is a model lighting ordinance created by the IDA/IES that could serve as a basis. I can give you a website where there are 22 examples of municipal noise ordinances. Denver and Phoenix are among them in our region. D2B5, consider a requirement that a development not reduce the service level of affected streets and intersections below their existing levels. And that would require the applicant to create or hire a third party to create a traffic analysis. D2B6, I have written a separate letter, which I hope is in your packets. If not, I have copies here, regarding a standard called ASHRAE 90.1-2016. That is the gold standard for energy efficiency in buildings that could be used to provide the standard that was mentioned that they couldn't find on page 6 of the staff report. D2B7, consider numerical limits on runoff volume per unit site area. This would require another kind of computer model that civil engineers are accustomed to making. D2B9, consider requiring a letter from the water district stating that sufficient water supplies are available to serve the project with current resources for a defined period of time. Otherwise, the port may become a pretext for developing water resources that would harm the Great Salt Lake and deplete groundwater. And finally, D3E, consider requiring all projects to submit an impact mitigation plan, not just the ones that require conditional use approval. I think this can be fairly straightforwardly introduced into the underlying zoning. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And Tom, I said your name, but you just said you didn't want to speak and you have some notes. Is that still the case? Did you want? I'll just say quickly that. Well, we need you up to the microphone if you're going to speak. Okay. It's better if it comes from you anyway.
My name's Tom McLaughlin. I live in downtown. I've been a resident of Salt Lake City for 14 years. My grandchildren live here. My daughter lives here. As you know, everyone is concerned about the quality of life. And while the port is a fait accompli that is going to be here, I just want you to strengthen your efforts wherever possible to preserve the air quality and the quality of life here. We know that there's going to be tremendous growth in the valley. There's going to be more cars. There's going to be more trains are run on diesel. That's more particulate, that's more pollution. In the report that we saw, 3 times it was mentioned that air quality would be improved. That was stated in that the staff report. I'm looking for the improvement. How is the air quality going to be improved? So I'll just go on record to tell you, fight the good fight. Look for as many methods to preserve the quality of life in Salt Lake. And I'll make one other comment, and that is I was so impressed with your handling and the presentation for the Ronald McDonald House, where we covered security, the height of the fence, all these specific questions are asked. And that was, you did diligence, and they did a great report. Here we are with the Port District that's coming in and saying, we haven't worked it out yet, but we want you to rule on all this zoning, which is totally unfair and upside down. So thank you very much.
Thank you. John Kotab? Am I butchering it that bad that you don't even know it's you? Is there a John? Oh, he left. I'm told he left. I'm glad you know. Terry, it's you.
Thank you for the time. I'm going to set my clock, so get off. So I'm going to give you the pepperoni pizza talk. So my name is Terry Marasco. I'm a board member of Utah Moms for Clean Air. And I've been studying the air issue for 13 years. Utah Moms started about 2006 when we had 28 days of red air in a row. The bottom line that we have to look at is the areas are out of attainment now. If we put another truck on the road, we're so close to being out of attainment. So when you consider all of this, you need to think about how we're going to, quote, improve air quality, but sustain it. But really my point is to look beyond the boundary of the port. Let me give you an example. We took some folks out to the prison site, and Rio Tinto's tailings, it happened to be a windy day, I think it was in April. They were blowing across the tailings over to the prison site. You couldn't see past Route 80 as we looked west because of the tailings dust. Now that's legal. Rio Tinto is allowed to do that. The point of this is, I think the Planning Commission has to look over the hill and say, we may have to change every ordinance in the city to sustain air quality as it is. So when you look at Amazon, by the way, and there was a mobile emissions discussion, they can put 1,000 diesel trucks on the road without any penalty or any impact statement, et cetera, unless something comes into these ordinances. But anyway, so my pepperoni pizza talk is, at some point down the road, are we going to say to wood burning, quiet.
You just started the pepperoni talk. We got to hear what it is.
Shut up, Terry. How do you stop this? There we go. I hate iPhone. Anyway, are we going to take away, we may have to, wood-burning pizza ovens, or are we going to have clean air? So as you look at this picture, you have to go beyond this inland port, because everything around us is causing air quality problems. The numbers I've looked at over the years state right now, there is no way, with the growth only, without Mountain, the Draper facility being built, and the inland port, that will ever be in attainment. Keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry. All right, that is all the cards that I have. Is there anybody else who would like to speak to this issue? If you do, just come on up. Yep, come on up. When you get to the microphone, give us your name, and then you'll have your 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Carl Moore. I'm the chairperson of Pandos and chairperson of SLC Air Protectors. Air Protectors, of course, is concerned about the environment. Pandos is concerned about humans, which is linked to the environment. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody out here who has spoken to this issue, who is concerned about the environment, who is concerned about humanity. I appreciate that we're thinking about prisoners because they're human beings. I appreciate that we're talking about the vegetation, the life, the life of the birds, the life of the animals, the life that are affected by, mosquitoes. I mean, this is so awesome. I really appreciate that, and I hope that this committee holds that to heart, and I hope that the Inland Port Authority, recognize that as well. One is, I understand you're in a kind of a weird situation. One is, I don't recognize any of those lines. As a Native American, those lines were never made by any Native American tribe. They were not made by the Goshute people. I'm looking right there. That's all Ute land. Right there, Ute land, Goshute land. That was never made by them. And I don't think that they were consulted. I think that that's a disgrace. I think that that's immoral. I think that what needs to happen is that the tribes need to have a voice in this because it's their land. It's not your land. It's not my land. I'm Hopi, and it's not your land. So I just would suggest, that we actually think about them. And again, I appreciate these people here who are acting like a community, because that's what community does. Community looks out for each other. And so I just appreciate that, and so just do the best you can. God bless, and just think about what's going on. Again, those lines weren't made by us. Those were made by somebody else, and somebody has usurped their stewardship. And just do what you can with what you got. So appreciate it quite.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Just give us your name and you'll have
Kathy
2 minutes.
Wilson. That was emotional. Thanks. I would just like to say that the community is totally behind making sure that this is done right. And when it is going to infringe on the quality of life of people in this community, we're ready to organize and stand up. So I want the staff to know that they've got support, and the Planning Commission to know they've got support.
Thank you very much. Anyone else? Okay. Do we close it today, or we're just continuing it for next time? Okay. So we're going to end our public comment for today, but we will continue our public hearing in 2 weeks. It is 2 weeks, right? Yeah, in 2 weeks at our next Planning Commission meeting. Thank you so much. That was incredible. And I think you all stayed incredibly on topic and on point and gave some really concrete suggestions. Maybe staff, do you want to come back up? I don't know. I'm guessing you guys took notes from that. And I think I just want to add some emphasis to some of those things. I mean, can we just add it all? Can you just, is that a lot? I do want to add, or one thing I want to add emphasis to is the kudos to you both and all of the staff for taking so much time to the public. The staff here in the planning office is so inundated, right? You know how hot the building economy is right now, and they have a lot on their plate outside of this that they're having to do in such a rapid amount of time. And it's so great that they've done this and done this research. And so even more important that we're getting the feedback from the community, because the more eyes we can get on this, the better, so that we make sure that we're addressing all of those issues. I love the attention to the light pollution and the sound pollution, really paying attention to the bird migratory patterns and the silos. I mean, I had no idea, but the silos, like making sure that they're patterned correctly. I think Mr. Scheer had some great comments with some specific standards, and I didn't catch them all, so perhaps you can meet with him later to get what some of those. Oh, we've got the note. That's right. Some standards from some other cities that really specify what's acceptable and what's not concerning the noise and the light pollution. I also love the idea of really, and I don't know, can we ask for some energy conservation components to be added into this that require a certain level of energy, on-site energy production? I mean, this is being thrown on us, so why can't we make this just as difficult as possible to be made? And if they're going to do it, it's going to be made exactly how it's going to be made perfect. Like they have to have air scrubbers that clean the rest of the air for us. I don't know. But I think those were some just really incredible, the landscaping, the pavement restrictions to add the permeability to the ground so that the water continues to seep into the ground. To the mosquito abatement suggestions. I mean, this is incredible.
No,
I enjoy that more than everybody else.
Okay, no, we all enjoyed it.
Thank you,
And
Brenda.
thank you all for doing that. And I also want to say thank you very much for the staff. I think this is an incredible job and very well framed, and the issues very well taken care of. I would like to understand how specific standards might fit into this rather than the as standards in terms of what somebody might have to produce as part of their mitigation plan. In other words, use those standards as a comparative basis to say, yes, this does or it does not meet this standard. If it does not, why not? You know, so it also protects the applicant as well, because it gives them a standard that they know if they pass it, then they pass. You know, and they don't have to worry about that anymore. So instead of it just being sort of all up in the air. So I would really try to seek how that might fit in. I agree with all the other concerns. I also want to ask the staff, what is the process for making these kinds of changes between now and the next time, or after next time? So what is the process by which these changes would be incorporated into the document that goes to City Council?
So at this point, we have about just over a week to work on any changes, because we have to publish the next draft for your consideration next Thursday.
Okay.
But
so
if those
it's-
don't get in there, there's still more time before it gets in there. So we
Exactly,
can,
yes. And there will be a lag before council, assumedly, that they put it on their own agenda, so there'll be even more time. I don't know if we have an exact time frame yet for when the council will put it on, but I assume there's at least a couple more weeks at least there. And then again, they can look at what conditions you put in your recommendation and ask us to go back, beef it up, et cetera.
So given that very short time frame, would it be appropriate for a lot of these things that we heard, that you may not have time enough for the next draft, but to compile a list of things you're still going to be reviewing, so we know you're going to look at it and we know you're going to not forget that it was brought up, just so that we have a reckoning of all of our notes and the things that you haven't had time to address fully, which I completely understand, but then also the city council. So we just have kind of a running tab of the issues that you're continuing to look at, so we and the public don't think that you just didn't put them in.
Yeah, I think in our staff report that we go out with, that goes back to you, we'll identify the things that were brought up, how we've responded to them, what we haven't been able to respond to yet.
That would be great.
So
I
it's
think
all
that would
tracked
really
and-
cover all the scenarios so that we're all informed and on the same page and not expecting you to jump tall buildings in a single bound.
I mean, I think, so we'll be presenting back to you, a draft ordinance. So we'll go back and do the best that we can to address what we can. But what we would be looking for you in 2 weeks is a recommendation to the city council on whether to approve or deny, or if there's other things the planning commission would like the city council to consider. That's what we'd like to get from you.
Yeah, and so to follow up on that, Wayne, I was also thinking if there were parts of these comments that were made that we feel are really important and you weren't able to address them to even your satisfaction because of the time limitation, that becomes part of that report, so that we aren't duplicating and adding on these same efforts again in 2 weeks, or we're saying that one is really important. We really want to highlight that you continue to research that after we make our recommendation.
Certainly, and just to be honest, we may go back and look at it and on some of these and think, you know what, we're not comfortable going that far right now. And so we would give you our proposal, and if the planning commission is comfortable then to say, no, we think you should, city council, we think you need to consider that would be part of your recommendation with conditions.
Wayne, I have a question perhaps for the staff or for you having to do with, is there a point at which the Port Authority can turn back these regulations and say, sorry, too much, you've gone, crazy, and, we can't require people, we'll never be successful if we're requiring everybody to do all this work?
That could happen at any given.
So they can.
Well, the Port Authority can't do anything to the regulations. What they can do is on an appeal, they can say, well, Salt Lake City's regulation frustrates the purposes, goals, intent, or whatever of the Port Authority. But there's always the possibility that the state
That's
legislature.
on appeal of individual projects.
That's on an appeal of a
So the person
specific,
would still have to produce
right.
the information if we require it.
And we know that the state legislature has expressed an intent to take a look at this thing year after year to see if there are any modifications, so they could always come and kick us in the teeth again.
Paul, correct me if I'm wrong on this, though, but I believe part of the law says that our proposed zoning amendments do need to be at least brought to the Inland Port Authority prior to adoption, so that's going to be part of the process.
I don't believe it. I don't believe the bill says that. I don't think that, do we have to run it by them? In fact, there's specific language in the bill that says that the Port Authority Board does not get involved in policy creation for Salt Lake City land use regulation.
That's an important distinction to understand, to know, because I think that if we, there may be, it seems to me like, yes, they can take everybody on appeal and turn it over, but that doesn't mean that people don't have to go through a lengthy process with the Planning Commission and the planning staff.
Right.
Would it be helpful to you for us to go through the list that I've created? I mean, it's essentially everything that people have said, or do you think you have it? Do you need more emphasis from us, or do you think you have? I mean, I honestly don't know that there's one thing that that was said that does not merit some sort of looking into.
If there's some in particular,
I mean, I would say
like particular focus on, I think that would be helpful.
A couple things that I would provide some emphasis to, I think. One is that, and I don't know that this was really brought up specifically, we talked about it before the public comment period, but is that having that third party, I don't know how that would fit, but I really like the idea of having some sort of third party being tasked with really evaluating what's going on, so that when we do have to make a conditional decision, we have some data from an impartial source who's going to give us some information that would be helpful, both for us to use in our decision, but then for down the line if it is brought to the Port Authority. And I don't know how that would work. I don't know how that would look.
Can I comment on that?
Yeah.
If you use specific standards, then those standards are professionally applied by people who are professional planners, designers, architects, engineers, and so forth. And so you can, I think, rely on the professional standards rather than the opinion of a
But if we're
outside
having to like
expert.
mitigate light pollution.
Yeah, but those are, there's standards for that.
And is that something that we would put can we put those standards in there?
We could put some sort of reference potentially into those our zoning standards that reference those standards.
Brendan,
Yes.
I think this was something that Wayne said they were going to give the director the ability to have an outside expert evaluate.
Yeah, but I wouldn't want to
the
suggest that
report.
every single project
No,
had to have
no,
an
but
outside
it's-
expert evaluate it, because that would be extremely expensive for the city to do.
But if there's a circumstance where it was necessary.
Who has to pay for it? Does the city have to pay for it, or does the developer?
Well, that's to be determined, but.
Well, there's that component, and I'm fine.
I think it's one way or the other.
Yeah,
sort
as
of.
long as we have some sort of measurable standards that we're putting, that we have. I love the idea of buffering for the prison, not only from the humanitarian standpoint, but also from like, hey, state, you're going to put the prison there. We're going to also put a buffer around that so you can't put your port next to it. I think that, I like that idea. But I think the humanitarian standpoint is a clear winner with all the people that will be working there and living there. And I think we absolutely have a task to consider that residential as we would for any other residential point. I liked Dita Seed brought up the idea that, and I don't know, maybe this is already in there and it's hard to process it all at one time, but If it is over the landfill, does that bring into any other soil issues? And I don't know what that would do. Is it compact enough to hold trains, and what do we?
That's something that they would have to evaluate. There has not been a proposal yet for the actual port. So
Right.
there's a whole nother extensive process that they'll have to go through. Not only with the old landfill, they're gonna have to make sure that it's not gonna create any issues with water systems and things like that. They're gonna have to make sure it's engineered to hold all the trains and the weight and the
Okay.
freight, things like that. So
Okay.
it's,
And they would take into consideration any sort of other pollution that might come from.
yeah, and they would be subject to a lot of federal standards because it would be a rail facility. So
Okay.
there's still a lot to be done before something
Sure.
like that could be built.
I mentioned at the beginning, I love looking at the landscaping and the pavement to create as natural as an environment as possible.
And sorry.
Yeah.
So with the Northwest Quadrant overlay, we already have
Right,
native
I remember that.
landscaping in place. So
That's
I'm not sure if you want to consider that for south of I-80 and along 2200 West. It is a little more built out south of I-80. So we might get, sections that are landscaped and then sections that are not. So that might be.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I forgot that was there already, and I think that probably addresses it, because I remember that distinctly. You did a great job in addressing that with the M1 zone when we were doing that originally. Anything we can do? I think Mr. Shear's comments with those standards with the noise and light, and I tried to jot some notes down, but we've got the notes here in our record. And then anything we can push for energy production and conservation, I think would be, sort of to offset. If we know it's gonna be creating this impact, that there's not a lot we can do. So perhaps they can offset that by also generating power for the community. Anything else? Any other things that stand out? And those are not exclusive of everything else that was said. I think that there's a lot. And I think those general ideas were repeated generally through the whole thing.
I just want to make a comment, even though most of the audience has left. Community input is always important, and I'm only speaking for myself, but I'm sure you'll all agree with me in that we take them very seriously. But I'll be really honest. Tonight was probably the best public comment period I've ever listened to in my 9 years of community activism outside of the Planning Commission. And I really want to thank you all for the care you took in the points you made, and that you each built on your own expertise and gave us things to really think about in addition to what we've already been presented. And I encourage you to continue to do that, especially with the City Council. But I really want to just point out to you how well that was done, and I appreciate all your efforts.
Anything else? Okay. Thank you both so much. Thanks for
Thank
all
you.
your work and continued work, and we'll see you in a couple weeks for some more fun. And thanks, everybody, for your comments again. All right, moving on to our, second to last item, and this is the work session item, the Exchange Plan Development and CBSD at approximately 320 East, 400 South. Hi.
Hi. Wasn't sure if you were going to take a little break. So.
Sorry. Nah.
This is a work session for mixed-use development located at approximately 320 East, 400 South, in the TSA UCC zone. That's Transit Station Area Urban Center Core Zoning District. Downtown Salt Lake City Partners is the developer representing Salt Lake City Corporation, and they have initiated petitions for plan development and conditional building and site design. Staff has recommended this work session to the applicant so that we can be aware of any concerns that the Planning Commission may potentially have, so that those concerns can be addressed before coming before you for a decision in the future. So the proposal consists of 2 buildings, referred to as Building A and B. Building A is a 9-story structure with over 15,000 square feet of retail and 286 mixed income units. And Building B is a 5-story structure with 2,700 square feet of retail, 126 mixed income units, and 30,000 square feet of incubator and co-working space. Both buildings incorporate green building techniques. As part of the planning process, because this property is within the TSA zoning district, the applicant was required to obtain TSA development review scores. And if they score over 125 points or more, those can be approved by staff. And planning staff did approve those TSA scores. However, because they're requesting the modifications to the design standards and additional building height through plan development, that's why the petition's before you. In addition, so the applicant is requesting modifications to some of the design standards for both buildings. A chart outlining those requested design modifications is located in staff's memo on page 4. So the requests for Building A include 5 feet of additional building height through plan development, and then conditional building and site design for design standards related to active ground floor use and visual interest, the distance between ground floor building entrances, maximum length of a blank wall, required entry feature, and maximum length of a street-facing facade. And the requests for Building B are all of the same requests that I just stated for Building A, with the addition of ground floor glass and parking along a street frontage, that street frontage being Blair Street. After reviewing the submitted plans, the Planning Division identified issues generally related to the pedestrian-oriented design of the building. We didn't include analysis on the requested modifications that staff is of the opinion meet the standards of approval, and I won't be going over those tonight. We were hoping to focus the discussion just on areas where staff has concerns, and then of course if the Planning Commission has additional concerns, those can be raised, but we didn't focus on the positive aspects of the proposal that staff feels meets the intent of the design standards. So as a starting point for further discussion, I'll go over some of the concerns that staff has related to the design standards. In relation to Building A, the increased facade length on 400 South, so 200 feet is permitted and the applicant is requesting 277 feet. And this is along 4 South. The upper stories of this elevation utilize variations in materials and recessed windows to help visually break up the overall massing of the facade. And a portion of that upper 3 stories is also recessed as a rooftop terrace. And staff thinks that in order to meet the intent of that design standard, which is how those modifications are approved through the conditional building and site design, that some more articulation on the ground level could help meet that intent. The standard calls for, if a building is longer than 200 feet, that it have a 20-foot separation. If the buildings can't be separated, maybe the applicant can look at some more options for the ground level of the building from the pedestrian perspective. And then the increased length of the blank wall on 300 East. So 15 feet is permitted, 30 feet is requested. This area is concealing a stairwell and elevator for the building. Staff's of the opinion that the request for the increased blank wall area would more closely meet the intent of this design standard, or may not even require a modification if architectural detailing such as a change in plane, texture, materials, scale of materials, or patterns or art were added to the wall. In regards to Building B, staff has concerns with the active use and visual interest at the ground floor along Blair Street. Many of the modifications requested for Building B are directly related to the proposed ground floor parking. Staff does acknowledge that because of the dimensions of the site, locations to incorporate parking for the development are limited. However, the applicant does need to demonstrate how the requested modifications meet the intent, which is to activate the streetscape. Blair is a small mid-block street, however, it's still a street and it is worthy of each of the associated design standards. As currently proposed, staff's of the opinion the requested reductions to the active use and visual interest requirements paired with the increased facade length along Blair Street, which is almost twice as long as what's permitted. 200 feet is permitted and about 378 feet is proposed. The additional ideas should be explored for increasing the street activation and the visual interest along the whole facade. There is a lot of visual interest towards the end of the facade where it curves along Blair Street, but some of those same concepts across the whole ground floor of the development. And then finally, there's some they're required to have 9 building entrances along Blair Street. It's an entrance every 40 feet. They have proposed 4 entrances along Blair Street, and staff's of the opinion that the entrances that are proposed, based on the information that we have, they're rather discreet and seem more like service entrances, so if there's some way that those can be further emphasized, we feel that that would be closer to the intent of the design standards. And then there is a mid-block walkway identified in the Central Community Master Plan. And the TSA zoning standards also call for development of a mid-block walkway if it is included in a master plan. There's also some standards for those mid-block walkways, which is it's a 10-foot wide path and then 6 feet of that unobstructed for pedestrians. The applicant is exploring options to include a walkway on an adjacent parcel to the south of the development site, which is currently used for parking for the public safety building, and additional information is needed in relation to the development's inclusion of the walkway, its alignment, and its design. Staff generally doesn't have concerns with the plan development request for the additional height. And again, we think it would be most useful to focus the discussion on the requested modifications of the design standards and the conditional building and site design standards as they relate to the development. And at this point, I can answer any questions that you may have for staff, and the applicant's also here for the work session. And we do have representatives from Housing and Neighborhood Development as well. They are the division from the city that's working on this project.
Great, thank you very much. Any questions right now? Okay. I guess we'll just go to, we'll go to the applicant to give their presentation. And then I guess we'll have a discussion from there.
Hi.
Good evening.
My name is Chris Parker. I'm with Give Group. We've got another partner developer, Domain, out here from New Orleans, actually, today, who's also here that can further answer any questions. We're pretty excited about this project. Let me pull up a couple slides, maybe. Sure, there's a way to full
Can
screen
you pull
this.
the mic just a little bit closer to you? We're not picking you up.
We're not getting your excitement through the microphone.
That's right.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Yeah.
Is there an easy way to go ahead and full screen a page? If not, not a big deal. You know what? Don't worry about it. Such is life. So a little bit of history on this project. This was the old Barnes Bank site, about half a block away. The city put out an RFP for development proposals on the site. We were lucky enough to be selected. Had some interesting timelines with that. We applied to the city under the old TSA standards, and in the interim they were changed, and then we found out that we won. So It's great. I think the design actually stood up to both standards very well. But a little bit of history on that. We started thinking about this project almost as an end cap to the civic square that we're on right here. We wanted it to be kind of massively inclusive, both with the residents that are allowed in it, which it does. Almost half of this building is provided for people making between 40 and 80% AMI. It does that without any 9% tax credits, which is the first time in the state that that subsidy has not been required to provide that level of affordability. It's the tallest residential rental structure, at least so far in the city, proving that you could build a steel building in Salt Lake City and make it work was something that we wanted to do. And honestly, providing something on 400 South that was very much mixed use, and not just mixed use because it was made to be, is another thing that we were looking to do. All of those, I'm an affordable housing developer. I think all of those, as we're attacking affordable housing in the city, needed to be proved. We need to prove you can do more density in this city, that you can provide affordable housing without 9% subsidy, and that you can do so in a way that fits in well with the neighborhood. So we're really excited about this project. Probably for the sake of time, I know you guys have heard from a lot of people today, we'll just go directly to the questions staff has posed on this particular project. So this is building A. To give you an idea of where we are, on your left is the public library. On the south is the public safety building. The project consists of two buildings, as she mentioned. They're fairly simple in design. They take cues from their two large neighbors. So the materiality of the bottom floor is primarily derived from the library, which it addresses on its west flank. And the kind of blue simplicity on the top of the building kind of pays homage to the public safety building to the south. That kind of simplicity, I think, is part of the reason the current design that has, let's see if I can pull it up, that has a couple spots of discussion was presented the way that it was. If you kind of look at the left of the screen, the blue kind of goes down a little bit and goes to the actual floor. Visually speaking, that plane kind of exists behind the white. And so it was presented that that plane would remain kind of a pure blue instead of adding a fourth or a fifth texture into the design. Ultimately, we'll provide whatever the Planning Commission deems worthy on that, but we felt that having a very simple building similar to the very simple but interesting designs of its two large neighbors would be appropriate in that case. As a point of reference, this corner actually looking onto People's Way will be a large kind of food market. Imagine a mall food court, except all of these stations are kind of authentic local food. This incubator will go ahead and not only give diversity of food options in this area, but also give a lower cost entry into the food business for many of the low and moderate income people that not only will live here, but frequent this area quite a bit. So that would be kind of the second of the two that was discussed on this particular building. Is we're happy to add some insets, some outsets, some fenestration there. We currently just liked the simplicity of the blue staying on one plane, kind of the logic of the building there. We'd be interested in input from the Planning Commission on kind of how they saw that issue. We're happy to go either way. The other issue was on this face. Basically what we've done, because the building is somewhat longer than was anticipated in this zone, is we've broken it up into two main pieces. You basically have two white buildings, so to speak, and they're broken by a blue plane to break up the facade. I think part of what planning was thinking might happen is kind of in the very middle there, as the blue plane comes down, they're thinking perhaps a bump out or a bump in might help the pedestrian experience of that building as you're walking by it. Again, we're happy to comply if that's kind of a hard mandate. The same logic applied for why it wasn't included in the initial submission. Just having that blue plane, which exists behind the white, maintain in its plane and not kind of add busyness, if you will, to a relatively simple design. So those were the two principal points brought up on building one. Building two, or should I ask for comments building by building or all at the end?
I think you can probably keep going.
Okay, great. So this is the 400 South face of Building 2. It's a very interesting site between the two of them. Basically, you've got Building A, which is surrounded by 4 streets, and then Building B, which is visible from 3 sides and is on an extremely skinny lot, which I think drives a lot of the questions that staff had on Blair Street. So this building, looking at 400 South, the entire upper portion, if you will, is office incubator space, 30,000 feet of it. The bottom floor, which I can show you a blow up of here, is all retail face. So our 400 South face is 100% active use, both on the top and the bottom. It's a pretty handsome building. The kind of logistics of this building are you have the office and the retail in the front, and then you have a relatively small style, a micro unit of residential for 126 units in the back. A third of this building is available at 40% AMI, which again has not been done in this state to my knowledge without the use of 9% tax credits. Another third of the building roughly is at 80% AMI, and then another third is a market rate product. This is the view of that building from 300 East. Basically, because this project unusually had 7 sides between the 4 on the Building A and the 3 visible on Building B, which it had to look pretty for, we chose to maximize the pedestrian experience on the main streets that humans would interact with. So 400 South is 100% active use. 300 East on Building A, except for that stairwell that was mentioned, is again 100% active use. The view of Building B from 300 East is very pleasant. You have at the bottom that kind of jut coming through is residential entry space. The whole building articulates back, and this is kind of a rear view of what that articulation does. So you have a sculptural aspect to the building on the 300 East facade. So from 400 East, you're 100% active and interesting. 300 East, you're 100% active, and then in the rear view, interesting. And then on People's Way as well on Building A, the vast majority of that is also retail. So we wanted to maximize the pedestrian experience where there would actually be pedestrians. Blair Street, in some ways, was the one that got used the least. So there's certain utility concerns for both buildings were handled on that street. And I think that leads a lot to the staff's proposed changes on Blair Street. Basically, let me pull this up. You have a straight building that was designed to be 3 buildings conceptually because it is longer than anticipated in the zone. You have your front area that we looked at before, which has a recessed main floor, and it occupies the front chunk. You have a middle chunk, which is basically of a certain design vernacular, and that's kind of the utility for the whole project space. And then you have this deep articulated, almost structural space going south, and then going into a proposed mid-block pedestrian walkway on city land. The vast majority of the questions on this application happen between here and here. Basically, this piece of the parcel right here is barely big enough to get a building in. In fact, we couldn't put residential here. So this is where our office space is. And the pedestrian experience of that, because we didn't want to have a surface parking lot, is basically that parking's right up on the side. So one of the questions I had for the Planning Commission today is there's 2 basic ways that we can kind of deal with that and make it a pleasant place to walk by. One would be a fairly opaque screen that could have public art on it. It could have an interesting design kind of punched in the metal. You could have, walking down that street, you could have an experience like you might be viewing something in a gallery. The other way to go is to have a very transparent space where you might know that there's a parking garage behind it. Less artistic, but there has been some expressed desirability for that permeability into the inside of the building. Some direction on that from the Planning Commission would be helpful. We're happy to go either way. The way that we've proposed so far, if I can pull this up. Is to have a screening material. Kind of the third one from the left is probably the most appropriate. So you'd have this translucent punched panel that would lets you have permeability. You could see if a human was behind it, but you couldn't really tell what was going on behind it, with some interesting lighting features. We think that could be a nice thing to walk by at night. It's a little far away to go ahead and see the actual main floor use here, but I guess we're open to going ahead and providing an interesting pedestrian experience at that. We're not able to deepen the lot because of where the street is and get any parking in there whatsoever, and we thought hiding our parking was better than having a surface parking lot. So the current proposal is to have this sort of punched mesh. It doesn't have as many entries as you might were you on 400 South or our 300 South elevation, where there's somewhere to go for a pedestrian. It didn't make a lot of sense to put a doorway right into continually put doorways into parking stalls themselves, which is the reason why we proposed less entrances. But we're certainly open to providing as good a pedestrian experience on that street as possible, so long as we kind of know whether you guys would like to have artistic but somewhat opaque pedestrian experience or a translucent one that was a little less interesting.
For us, for our edification, these drawings we do have examples here in our stuff, so we can see it better than on the screen there.
Yep.
Can you explain to us, give us a little bit more? I'm seeing this as a door to a parking garage. Is that big dark thing there? I can't really quite
That's the
go
parking
back.
entrance.
About this right here?
Yeah.
Correct, that's a parking entrance.
Okay, that's a parking entrance.
So where do the people go in?
So there are, let me pull a slide for that. Here are the proposed entrances in the front. So you have two in the front of the retail. You have entrance into the office space. You have an entrance into the hallway that'll take you up to the residential space.
Right.
And then in this particular area, you have the vehicular entrance. This is the one we talked about a little bit ago. You have the main lobby of the residential entrance entering here and here. And then you have kind of utility entrance on the back of the building. So adding entrances, were you to add something right here, there's not the space to fit parking and actually have anything in here you would go to. And so you could put some fake doors, but that's what they would be. They would just be kind of dummy doors that no one could enter into.
Well, I think we shouldn't have to ask where the public needs, the people go to get in the apartment building. From that view, it was like it was all the same.
Sure.
If you go to the rendering from People's Way, that's a good, right there.
So this area right here is where you go into the residential space.
Which is a double height space with glass.
So it'd
But we're
be a
talking about
20-foot measure.
the problematic area is the purple area on your elevation. And that would be on the east side of the street as you go along street now.
Blair Street.
Blair Street. And so you would be walking for perhaps, 200 feet?
Not even.
Yeah, this section is probably 120, 140.
100 feet or so in front of what's essentially a parking garage on the ground level.
Correct. On the other side of building one.
So our rules require that be something like something with, that we don't have parking garage on the ground level, but we do all over the place. So you do have stuff on the west side of that street, right? So you do have sort of activated space on the west side of that street. Is that street wide enough for you to do substantial landscaping along there as well?
No, sadly not. This site, to give you an idea, I mean, this is the minimum width that a double-loaded parking corridor can be. And so where we could bump in and weren't using parking, we've created a larger walkway here. But if you want any parking at all, then this is kind of the dimensions you're working with. And the street itself is already a very narrow street. So it wasn't something we could even push into the existing sidewalk or street to get into. It's a weird lot.
And above that is office, you said, correct? On both
Yeah,
of those sections.
the bottom floor here is retail, and then everything above this section is office.
And except for that particular portion, then the relative number of entrances. I think the idea of having multiple entrances is that you don't, get bored. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. So you don't get bored as you walk along the street edge, but in front of you on this one is the public safety building. Next to you is your other building, A, and, pretty soon you're going to be coming along in front with the People's Way. There's a lot going on. I'm not so sure you're going to be that bored. So, so I don't mind having some kind of a screen along there, even a semi-transparent screen, so you would have you would be able to see activity within the parking garage, plus also you would be able to maybe even get a little ventilation into the parking garage as a part of that design, because I know that's going to be an issue for you there. So, I mean, cars are what we are. I mean, otherwise, I don't know how you can do this in a way that's not sort of fakey doors that don't go anywhere. That's worse.
And looking up, there's nothing boring about the elevation.
Right. That's sort of what I'm saying, is that there's a lot
plenty above you.
There's a lot to see.
Right.
There's a lot in front of you. This is just one of those situations that happens in an urban area where you can't do everything at once. I think many, especially buildings, I know trying to design a building that has multiple sides that need to be the front is an extremely difficult thing to do anyway. So that, I don't know what the rest of the commission feels like, but that, it doesn't bother me that much. I would probably be inclined to go ahead with some kind of a screening, even a really cool screen that, had, like when you walked one way, it looked like one thing, and walked the other way, it looked like another thing, or something like that.
Sure.
Some kind of artful screen.
Yeah, so I would say when I'm walking along buildings that are no entrances, it's about being bored, but I always get this feeling like, well, that is not inviting at all. Nothing about this building says you want me to come in or I'm welcome. So obviously the interest that keeps drawing you down. I want to bring up the mid-block walkway because for me that's actually a really important part. Mm-hmm. And I only saw one brief snippet of it, but the south wall of Building B.
Right here?
Yeah. I'm not feeling any good vibes from that. And I'm wondering, because if that's where you're proposing then to continue that mid-block walkway, that gets some better treatment to extend, because I think part of what will draw people down Blair Street to walk, not only you have these artistic screenings, which I'm all for as well, but is you want to get to that mid-block walkway and cut through. And so that's in some way a destination. And where the city has been successful in putting mid-block walkways, it's a huge game changer for how people move.
Sure.
I live in a community where we were able to break up a huge block, and it has made a huge difference. And so I'd like to see some better attention to that south wall as well, because it's not an afterthought.
Sure.
I mean, I understand it's hard to design a building with 4 active sides, but something that's just a little bit more visually appealing, knowing that this is also going to be a draw of the people see as well. And I just want to make kind of this comment. So over the years, as I've worked with developers as a community person, I always hear people say like, oh, we took inspiration from this when we were designing this. And every time I always think, well, I don't get to see it at all. I literally, are you making this up? Because that can't be true. And when I looked at these buildings, Building A, I said to myself, that kind of looks like the library. So the first time ever, when you said that was inspiring you, I was like, I actually see it.
Great.
Building A actually was something that I was like, I really like that one.
We're happy to be the trendsetter there.
Yeah, you're the first one, and I'm going to say I've been doing this for 10 years actually. You're the first one where I felt that looks actually like it was inspired by something, and so I appreciate that. In reference to the question before us regarding that design strip of solid blue, I feel like when you're a pedestrian, you're not getting that whole experience. And so as you're walking, to be not bored or to be inviting or to have something interesting, that doesn't necessarily translate to the pedestrian level of trying to that's part of the reason why we want things happening at that level, is because they're not seeing what's above.
Sure.
Because they're just in a different perspective. And so some treatment, whether it is texture or whether it is some other opportunity you have to break that up, I think is important. I get why you like the design as it's broken up from the white sections, but I think the pedestrian isn't going to be experiencing that or appreciate it.
Okay.
I see what the city is trying to do, and I think that's an important one, because it's an important corner, and you're gonna be getting a lot of foot traffic.
Sure.
There. So it's that building A to me is really inviting. The retail on building B, I don't feel that same invitingness going on, and I don't know what you can kind of do to address that, but I get two separate feels about how the retail is being treated.
Sure.
On those two
And the
buildings.
retail at 400 South on the
Building A
on
retail
Building B.
feels really inviting. There's the way it's designed and interacting in the rendering versus the retail on Building B.
So at this corner, that's not.
It has a very distinctly different feel.
It's more of a commercial
than
building.
Building A.
Get you to speak into the
And
microphone,
it doesn't
please.
feel.
Thanks.
I'm sorry.
You're okay. Go ahead.
So that's really, for the most part, my notes. And then at some point, I'd like to have a question for neighborhood and housing development.
Okay. So I also noticed the connection to the library almost immediately. And I had a follow-up thought was, I wonder if the library would be approved today. Because I'm actually not a fan of the library. I'm a fan of the library shape. I'm a fan of the library interior. I don't like the beige of the library. So to see the continuation of the beige of the library, I'm not thrilled about, I have to be honest.
So if they kept the design elements of the boxy, but not beige, would that be? Is it just the beige that bothers you?
Beige bothers me.
Which I agree with. I mean, the beige is a fairly bleh color.
I mean, I have nightmares about 400 South. I was commenting on our tour earlier that I would have wished that the Sizzler would have remained in the spot where the building that is recently completed is now, because the Sizzler looked better and more inviting. And so for me, one of the major issues on this, aside from the library look, is the length of the buildings, and I know that's one of the issues. And that's also, since I've been on this commission, the two biggest things for me are beige stucco and gigantic footprinted buildings, which I just think are beige is overdone, and giant footprints ruin the pedestrian experience because it's just too long. I actually do think, I agree, it does seem inviting to me. But for me, I actually, oddly, even though I hate 400 South so much about it, I think that the better opportunity here is to focus on the People's Way and the plaza area in there, because that is way more pedestrian friendly than 400 South will ever be. Yeah. Because 400 South has, I think, 85 lanes of traffic, I'm not sure. So, and you've got that, you've got the corner there, but then, you know, you're walking through this great plaza that the library has, and you're looking down, and then you see what kind of a cool building, but it's kind of a wall, and then it's a parking garage, and so it's kind of like a yeah, it's just kind of, I don't know that it doesn't really make the plaza, it doesn't really add to the plaza. I don't feel like from that angle. Brenda, I feel like you're getting stressed for my comments. And that would be my only thought, is that I think I would be willing to give up some stuff on 400 South to have more on Blair and focus on People's Way.
Sure.
Including, you know, I'm sad that there, and I'm guessing there's not a way. I'm sad that the mid-block walkway can't continue straight through there rather than be directed around, because I think that's lost through that length of that building. I mean, that is an incredibly long building, and I don't know that it's going to be particularly pedestrian friendly to continue on the walk down, unless there is some wayfinding and stuff to make sure that that does happen along there. To Amy's point, making sure that the south end of the building draws people and invites people and encourages people to continue to walk that way. But if you're walking down People's Way, you get to Blair, then you walk by a parking garage to continue on the walk. It's just, it's not, I don't know that it's the best pedestrian experience. So I don't know if there would be a way to remove the activity on 400 South and replace that with a parking garage and move the retail in. I think that would be interesting to me.
I just don't think retail would be viable on Blair. You're not going to have the traffic.
I mean, not even, I
really
mean, you've got the one already, right, on the corner there?
On Peoples?
For Building A, you've kind of already done it.
Yeah, at the corner of 300. But yeah, I think we'd be dealing with a lot of vacancy.
Don't be intimidated. I'm just looking at you.
I'm not intimidated.
Thinking.
You know, I think that as I've seen pedestrian flow in my community, and there are some that are windy because we couldn't get straight shots. And even thinking about where the McClellan Canal Trail is going to go is all over the place. And at some point it is, if you build it, they come. Right, so you want to have something interesting there. It doesn't always have to be retail, but when you're doing walkways, it's about you're off the street, you're having a different experience that's safer, you can be more leisurely, or you have a different pathway to get where you want to go. And so that invites people just in that regard.
Don't you think there's going to, I mean, do you think there's more potential for more pedestrians to be walking there than on 400 South?
No, because people are so lazy, they'll be like, oh, that's so much farther. But I know, because I think 4 South is what you have to activate in relationship to tracks and those stops, and you'll get movement there. And I think what you get on the walkway,
I mean, 400
some of
South
those,
is never going to be a pleasant pedestrian experience, no matter how much we activate it.
well, but I think too, this walkway is also an amenity
Sidewalks are
for the
too
people that
small.
live there. So they will be using this walkway a lot as well. And then people that live around there and commute will, I mean, that'll be a well-used walkway. I feel like any opportunity we have to break those up is really important because people will be using them.
Yeah, oh, I agree. We got to break it up for sure.
I just don't know that I see activating that in favor of 4 South. I don't know that I agree
Okay.
with that.
All right.
Just my 2 cents.
Yeah, it's fair.
Can I add one quick comment?
Yeah.
I'm Michael. I work with Domain Companies, also an architect, overseeing both of these on the design side. Something we haven't really touched on yet, and it's a nuanced, funny thing that we had to deal with in the design, is with these giant sites, there's a lot of slope happening too from 400 South heading south. And something that you don't see on any of these images, and it goes into the conversation you're just having about sidewalk experience, is 400 South along A, we have sort of 2 sidewalks, because to make the building and the retail and everything work, we had to make specific decisions on slab elevations for the building itself. And so on 400 South and 300 East, you're not seeing it in this package, but if you look at our overall landscape plans, or even that corner where we just were at, there's a elevated walkway with terrace seating coming down towards a lower sidewalk. So there's a lot more activation going on in the landscaping.
Are you talking on 4 South or on the walkway part?
But, well, 300 East, 400 South, around A, there's technically 2 separate sidewalks, which you don't pick up on these plans or in the renderings, because the renderings is very difficult to model site. Same with B, we have a slope that we had to deal with. It's why we have the entrance to the parking garage where it is. But I think it's something else, if we can provide you more information on, you'll see a lot of more activation, both via the landscaping
I
and
mean, I definitely
sidewalks.
want to see something a little bit different and better for Building B on 4 South.
And there's even on the front on 400 South, there's a lot of landscaping that's not shown on this rendering.
Yes, I want to see something better and more inviting on the 4 South and the walkway side, so the north and the south end.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Say that again.
Oh, I just wanted to see something, a little bit better treatment on the north and the south of Building B.
Meaning the retail and the south wall.
Great.
right?
And we've even kicked around uses for that walkway, the through walkway, even public amenity stuff. I don't know if we want to dive into that, but we understand what
No,
you're
I just
saying
think
about
it's
the facade.
important that
Yeah.
it happens. I personally would like to see the buildings break up for that, but I understand this is a weird lot. And so, I try to take those into consideration and balance, but that it needs to happen is a priority for me as we develop these spaces, because these are our opportunities to do this. So the mid-block walkway, I'm okay that it curves, I'm okay that it does that, but I'm really committed to seeing that it happens. So I'm glad that you're paying attention to that, where it's going to go, but then also that south end, yeah.
Go ahead, Brenda.
Well, I want to talk about, I previously just talked about the screening and so forth, but I do want to talk a little bit about some of the things that I like about this plan, and because there are actually very many. First of all, I do like the way that the Building A is articulated, as all of you have said, and the color separation seems to make a lot of sense to me, and I probably wouldn't require much change on it. I'm going to expect that it's going to be activated by people, and that makes it, something more interesting. I do have a question about the 4th Street elevation, because you were talking about there being two levels of sidewalk. Is that what you're saying on the 4th Street elevation?
Correct.
Because I'm seeing some of the line there. Is that a planter? Is that what is that?
One, we have minimal landscaping requirements. We also had I forget what the required setback was for the whole building.
Right.
But we also dealt with it, again, the elevation of the site. And so the retail slabs are up, let's say, generically 3 feet from the curb.
Okay.
And so Oliver and his architecture team did a bunch of studies and we're also trying to hit the space between entry door requirements, which we have to address in sidewalks. So the easiest way for us to do that was to have a low sidewalk along the street and a higher sidewalk to help us.
And then between those, a planter.
Between those, there's steps that I forget how long the planters are, but yeah, there's planters and steps.
So you can see
separating
that best on page 62 of our work here, where you can see on the right side there's on Building A, there's a planter shown here, and then there would be some interim steps, ramps, etc., to get up to the upper sidewalk. Okay? Everybody see that? That's actually going to have sort of an effect on the street front, a lot of effect on the street front there, and a lot of variation along the street front too.
So we like to create retail that's set back too, if we had sidewalk cafes and things like that.
So in the way this building is articulated the way it is, if it comes down that way, I think you're going to be seeing a lot better than beige stucco. So I wouldn't worry about that too much.
It's also not stucco.
Yeah. And the other thing is that I want to point out is that in Building B, which I find very, very, very interesting, there's a setback on the ground level, or at least there's a setback on the ground level that brings the upper floor sort of over the top of it. That's kind of very different from the Building A, which I like as well. I don't think all the buildings need to look alike, and I think it's a pretty sophisticated elevation as well. But I particularly like the long. I like the long building. I think that not all the buildings in the world have to look like small 19th century buildings, and this one has the potential of being quite a singular building with its setbacks, its materials, and the way it sort of curves back around with that, the way it is. So I like the building. I think I would like to see I think it's a good point to look at the southern elevation of it, although I'm going to expect that if that ever gets built out, it's going to get built out with a lot of landscaping. You probably won't even notice that wall, but it doesn't. Nevertheless, there's no reason to make it as kind of let's say understated as it is.
Chris, can you put up the overall elevation? One other thing that you may not have picked up on, I think just the line drawing works best of B. That one works good. Any of those work good.
Yeah.
You can see how we sort of from 400 South going towards the People's Way, the commercial part has very sort of rigid, all the windows align, and as it bleeds back, not only is the building starting to bend away, the windows and the facade materials are starting to shift with screening.
I
and
think I commend you. It's a very interesting building. It has a lot of things going on with its facade, and so therefore I'm not too worried about breaking up the building in sort of artificial ways. It's not, it is a long building and relatively short compared to most building footprints. So in and of itself, it has a kind of it has an interest in that as well. So,
Brenda, wouldn't you say though the way it's designed, it actually does kind of break itself up?
Yeah, it kind of breaks itself up.
It already does that. I think
it does kind of break itself up. It has a natural, not a natural, but it has a designed way of sort of changing along that facade.
Yeah,
and I think that's helpful.
Our intent was to kind of show the change from commercial to the residential portion as you walk down Blair. So that's why it has that articulation difference.
That's what I like. That's all.
When we created the new zone for this, we had a discussion about length of buildings, and it was pretty important. In fact, the 200 felt long to me. The 200 feet felt long to me when we had the discussion, and that was just kind of what was set. And these are a lot longer. 277 feet on 400 South, 300 East, not too much longer. 378 feet for the Blair Street.
I think the length of the building is somewhat artificial in that it's how it visually ends up feeling. Does it feel like different buildings that are attached? It's more to me how it's broken up, whether it's architecturally or landscaping or something's visual,
Sure. Yeah,
so that you as a pedestrian don't necessarily always feel like you are walking along the most inhospitable blank wall you've ever been, and you're not invited, and boy, that was boring. Can I get to the corner fast enough?
Yeah.
But if there's interesting stuff and inviting stuff along the way, it doesn't feel as long. And so there are times when we have really long buildings that I try to look at what would be my experience as a pedestrian versus like this uniform that's too long because it's really long because of the number of feet. But I get your point. I mean, I think that's why I would want to pay attention to lengths of buildings, and why I think part of the ordinance and the things that were brought up by staff are really about how do we break that up, and how do we meet that in a way that goes along the intent of those design standards. And maybe we don't, maybe the intent of the design standard, as we interpret it for this, isn't a door every 40 feet, but it's some visual articulation that allows us to not feel like we're walking next to this really horrible wall.
Maureen, Clark, anything? Any feedback? This is our work session, so we're just providing some thoughts and feedback. So anything to add?
So if we're done, I had a question for housing.
Oh, that's right.
But I also wanted to say, because we've been trying to give you feedback of how we feel the buildings, I want to say thank you for the amount of affordable housing you are putting into this. And we kind of lost that, because that's a big deal for us as a city, but as a planning commission, we tend to sometimes overlook, oh, like, they're doing this great thing. Let's focus on this. I just wanted to take the opportunity to say that that's much appreciated, and a big reason to really like this project as well.
Thank you.
So
We also try and, pay close attention that even though it is affordable housing, that there's no look and feel of it necessarily.
Yes.
So, couldn't tell the difference between this and, the best.
because it would probably be one of, if I didn't have a house, that would be me renting your affordable housing. So I appreciate that. So I just had a question for you, because you're kind of overseeing this, and I wanted to understand what, because usually the RDA, when they work through, they'll tell us, like, these are the things we were trying to accomplish. And I just wanted us to have the benefit of hearing from you. What were the things when you wrote the RFP and when you were making selections, what were the things you were trying to accomplish as well, so that we kind of see the whole picture?
So I might have to say that I'm going to have to come back to you, because I was not here when the RFP was put forward. I am familiar with the affordability and the components that you've already heard about this evening. The city is obviously interested in using our resources to support these types of developments. The only things I'm aware of related to the funding components, if that's what you're getting at a little bit with the development.
Well, I think it's more of an overall education for me of, I don't know. So I guess let's harken back. So when we're more familiar with the RDA, when they do these type of projects, and the components that they're looking at are generally derived from the goals and visions of master plans. And so they're a little bit more easy to translate for me in terms of a planning commission role. But since you're driving this one, are those components things that you look at at all, or are they just, you're focused on something completely different, and then how it's designed around the goals and visions of?
No, so we're definitely looking at the master plan, the area for downtown, but we're also looking at the affordability components and how do we didn't have the growing SLC plan at the time, but that's been an ongoing effort, and they've been with us through that. We want to make sure that we're using city properties and adjacent to city properties in a way that benefits the most possible folks. We give, the RFP process is more of a, here are the things that we as a city can offer, and then open it up to developers. And they gave us what we thought was the best mix of uses and possibilities on very challenging site. So
I think it's important for me to hear that, because I feel like you'll probably be involved in more projects as the future goes on.
Well, that is our hope. And these folks have been very brave in being some of the first. And we have every intention of bringing maybe not quite so challenging, but definitely interesting projects to bear as we move forward. So Todd Reeder has been the amazing proponent and partner with these guys from my team, and he's moving on to another position. So we're going to be working on kind of transitioning through that. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it's very helpful. I really just wanted to get a better understanding
about the RFP and what the
No, I think I'm
priorities of
good.
that
I
will
really,
help.
it really was trying to elevate your role in this in a way that I could see our
Sure.
our partnership. And so I think that was great, and I appreciate that time.
And I'd be happy to, if there are follow-up questions that we can provide more information, happy to do so. We have a very thick RFP that I brought if you want to look at it.
Real quick question on the height of the building. It was one of your things you're asking for, and I was just curious as to why not even taller, since you're already doing steel, and I assume that going taller would add to your ability to provide more affordability. I mean, I don't really know, but or affordable units. Is that something that?
That's exactly right. We are at the absolute top of what you can say yes to in the zone.
Really?
Yeah.
It's also a mix of balancing how high we can go, with
parking and that sort of thing.
Parking and construction costs and so forth. So we are doing a unique steel system, which is an infinity system. So the walls are actually prefabbed, and then they're laid. There's a tower crane, and each wall is set with that tower crane. Then there's a floor structure that comes in that's monolithic. But we're at a certain height with that if we went higher than what we're currently doing, then it would impact seismic, seismic use and so forth structurally. So we've maximized this as much as we can. And that was one of the goals of the RFP, was to maximize density.
How much, this is totally a crazy question, but how much does that cost compared to like just a wood construction?
Wood frame.
Because we see all these podium buildings that are
Quite a bit more.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah. Around mid-$20 a square foot.
Okay.
We really need people to speak into the microphones.
Oh, sorry.
So about mid-20s per square foot overall gross building cost versus wood frame.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay,
To
thanks.
Chris's point, if adding one story would have been tough. Adding 5 stories and you get into different systems.
Then you're in a
the
different
economics.
system altogether. Yeah.
Yeah.
But TSA kind of caps you at a certain place, and then if you meet a certain score, you can get one more story, and then that's kind of by virtue of meeting the statute, and then you can ask for an additional 5 feet on that. Our interest with building 1 specifically was to try to create as nice a product as possible, because we need those market rents to be high in order to get the affordability. So had we gone with just 10-foot ceilings on retail and like 9-foot ceilings on residential, we actually would be under the code, but we wanted a 16-foot retail area, and then we wanted each of our residential stories to be 10.5, so they could come down to 10 once you put all the piping in them. Again, just to make them really, really nice product. That's the only reason why it even needs to come before. But yeah,
Interesting.
I would love to see the TSA zone allow a little bit
Yeah,
higher.
I thought it did allow taller.
No, they're exactly right. You might be mixing this up a little bit, like our D1 district.
I'm sure I am.
Our D1 district has a height limitation that says by right you can build this tall. If you go any taller, then you could go through the conditional building and site design review, and then there's really no cap. But that's just in the downtown district. Any of our other zoning districts have actual ceilings on how tall you can go.
Interesting. Okay. Great. Well, do you need anything else from us before we see you again in the future, I guess?
I think we have a good understanding of what you're looking for, and
Okay.
we'll make some final tweaks before the next meeting and
Great.
resubmit. Yeah.
Any other
Thanks so much
comments from you
for
guys?
staying late.
Yeah, really appreciate your comments.
Great.
Yep,
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. That's nothing. All right. Our last item of business under our other business is our chair and vice chair elections. Our small group here tonight. Paul?
So I was just going to say, you do have a small group here tonight. If you feel like you need the other 3-4 members here to participate in the vote, you can push it, or
We did
you
that
can-
last time.
Or you can just, vote for the people who aren't here.
I was going to say, can we
as
nominate and vote
punishment.
for people who aren't here? Is there a rule against that?
There is not, but there's also the practicality of somebody who may not be willing to serve, so.
It's up, what do you guys think?
I propose we table this until we have, till our next meeting.
You just want me to be a chair again, don't you?
I want you to
Brenda.
be chair for the next inland port meeting. You did such a good, nice job, so.
Okay. All right, I guess if we're all on board with that, we will table that again. I don't think we need a motion for that, or do we? Do we need a motion to table
To
that?
table, yeah, it's on the agenda.
All right.
I mean,
Do we have a motion to table?
I just did. I
Oh,
moved to
we
table.
we have a Brenda, Clark, voting Amy.
Yes.
Brenda.
Yes.
Maureen.
Yes.
Clark.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. We're adjourned.